Section 1. The French Revolution. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The French Revolution by Hilaire Belloc. Section 1. Preface. The object of these few pages is not to recount once more the history of the Revolution. That can be followed in any one of 100 textbooks. Their object is rather to lay, if that be possible, an explanation of it before the English reader, so that he may understand both what it was and how it proceeded, and also why certain problems hitherto unfamiliar to Englishmen have risen out of it. First, therefore, it is necessary to set down clearly, without modern accretion, that political theory which was a sort of religious creed supplying the motive force of the whole business, of the new civil code, as of the massacres, of the panics and capitulations, as of the victories, of successful transformation of society, as of the conspicuous failures in detail which still menace the achievement of the Revolution. This grasps the way in which the main events followed each other, and the reason of their interlocking and proceeding as they did, must be put forward, not, I repeat, in the shape of a chronicle, but in the shape of a thesis. Thus the reader must know not only that the failure of the royal family's flight was followed by war, but how and why it was followed by war. He must not only appreciate the severity of the government of the Great Committee, but why that severity was present, and of the conditions of the war upon which it reposed. But in so explaining the development of the movement, it is necessary to select for appreciation as the chief figures the characters of the time, since upon their will and manner depended the fate of the whole. For instance, had the Queen been French, either in blood or in sympathy, had the King been alert, had any one character retained the old religious motives, all history would have been changed, and this human company must be seen if its action and drama are to be comprehended. The reader interested in that capital event should further seize, and but too rarely has an opportunity for seizing, its military aspect, and this difficulty of his proceeds from two causes. The first, that historians, even when they recognize the importance of the military side of some past movement, are careless of the military aspect, and think it sufficient to relate particular victories and general actions. The military aspect of any period does not consist in these, but in the campaigns of which actions, however decisive, are but incidental parts. In other words, the reader must seize the movement and design of armies if he is to seize a military period, and these are not commonly given him. In the second place, the historian, however much alive to the importance of military affairs, too rarely presents them as a part of a general position. He will make his story a story of war, or again a story of civilian development, and the reader will fail to see how the two combine. Now the Revolution, more than any other modern period, turns upon and is explained by its military history. On this account has so considerable a space been devoted to the explaining of that feature. The reader will note again that the quarrel between the Revolution and the Catholic Church has also been dealt with at length. To emphasize this aspect of the revolutionary struggle may seem unusual and perhaps deserves a word of apology. The reader is invited to consider the fact that the Revolution took place in a country which had in the first place definitely determined during the religious struggle of the 16th and 17th centuries to remain in communion with Rome, and had in the second place admitted a very large and important body of converts to the doctrines of the Reformation. The determination of the French people in the crisis of 1572 to 1610 to remain Catholic under a strong central government was a capital point in the future history of France. So was the presence of a wealthy, very large and highly cultivated body of dissentients in the midst of the nation. The two phenomena hardly coexisted elsewhere in Europe. Between them they lent to the political history of France a peculiar character which the 19th century, even more than the Revolution itself, has emphasized. And it is the opinion of the present writer that it is impossible to understand the Revolution unless very high relief is given to the religious problem. If a personal point may be noted, the fact that the writer of these pages is himself a Catholic and in political sympathy strongly attached to the political theory of the Revolution should not be hidden from the reader. Such personal conditions have perhaps enabled him to treat the matter more thoroughly than it might have been treated by one who rejected either republicanism upon the one hand or Catholicism upon the other. But he believes that no personal and therefore exaggerated note has been allowed to intrude upon his description of what is a definite piece of objective history lying in the field of record rather than in that of opinion. Some years ago the paramount importance of the quarrel between the Church and the Revolution might still have been questioned by men who had no personal experience of the struggle and of its vast results. Today the increasing consequences and the contemporary violence of that quarrel make its presentation an essential part of any study of the period. The scheme thus outlined will show why I have given this sketch the divisions in which it lies. Hilaire Belloc, King's Land, January 1911. The end of section 1. The end of the preface. Section 2, The French Revolution. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The French Revolution by Hilaire Belloc. Section 2. Chapter 1. The Political Theory of the Revolution. The political theory upon which the Revolution proceeded has, especially in this country, suffered ridicule as local, as ephemeral, and as fallacious. It is universal, it is eternal, and it is true. It may be briefly stated thus, that a political community pretending to sovereignty, that is, pretending to a moral right of defending its existence against all other communities, derives the civil and temporal authority of its laws not from its actual rulers, nor even from its magistracy, but from itself. But the community cannot express authority unless it possesses corporate initiative, that is, unless the mass of its component units are able to combine for the purpose of a common expression, are conscious of a common will, and have something in common which makes the whole sovereign indeed. It may be that this power of corporate initiative and of corresponding corporate expression is forbidden to men. In that case, no such thing as a sovereign community can be said to exist. In that case, patriotism, public opinion, the genius of a people are terms without meaning. But the human race in all times and in all places has agreed that such terms have meaning, and the conception that a community can so live, order and be itself is a human conception, as consonant to the nature of man as is his sense of right and wrong. It is much more intimately a part of that nature than are the common accidents determining human life, such as nourishment, generation or repose, nay, more intimate a part of it than anything which attaches to the body. This theory of political morals, though subject to a limitless degradation in practice, underlies the argument of every man who pretends to regard the conduct of the state as a business affecting the conscience of citizens. Upon it relies every protest against tyranny and every denunciation of foreign aggression. He that is most enamored of some set machinery for the government of men, and who regards the sacramental function of an hereditary monarch, as in Russia, the organic character of a native oligarchy, as in England, the mechanical arrangement of election by majorities, or even in a crisis, the intense conviction and therefore the intense activity and conclusive power of great crowds as salutary to the state, will invariably, if any one of these engines fail him in the achievement of what he desires for his country, fall back upon the doctrine of an ultimately sovereign community. He will complain that though an election has defeated his ideal, yet true national tradition and true national sentiment were upon his side. If he defends the action of a native oligarchy against the leaders of the populace, he does so by an explanation, more or less explicit, that the oligarchy is more truly national, that it is more truly communal than the engineered expression of opinion of which the demagogue, as he will call them, have been mouthpieces. Even in blaming men for criticizing or restraining an hereditary monarch, the adherent of that monarch will blame them upon the ground that their action is anti-national, that it is anti-communal, and in a word, no man pretending to sanity can challenge, in matters temporal and civil, the ultimate authority of whatever is felt to be, though with what difficulty it is not defined, the general civic sense which builds up in a state. Those words civil and temporal must lead the reader to the next consideration, which is that the last authority of all does not reside even in the community. It must be admitted by all those who have considered their own nature and that of their fellow beings, that the ultimate authority in any act is God. Or if the name of God sound unusual to an English publication today, then what now takes the place of it for many, an imperfect phrase, the moral sense. Thus, if there be cast together in some abandoned place a community of a few families so depraved or so necessitous that, against the teachings of their own consciences, as well as knowing that they are doing is what we call wrong, yet they will unanimously agree to do it, then that agreement of theirs, though certainly no temporal or civil authority can be quoted against it, is yet unjustifiable. Another authority lies behind. Still more evidently would this be true if, of say 12, 7 decided, knowing the thing to be wrong, that the wrong thing should be done. 5 stood out for the right, and yet the majority possessed by the 7 should be determined a sufficient authority for the wrongful command. But it is to be noted that this axiom only applies where the authority of the moral law, God, as the author of this book, with due deference to his readers, would prefer to say, is recognized and yet flouted. If those 12 families do sincerely believe such and such a general action to be right, then not only is their authority, when they carry it into practice, a civil and temporal authority, it is an authority absolute in all respects. And further, if upon a division of opinion among them, not perhaps a bare majority, nay, perhaps not a majority at all, but at any rate a determinate current of opinion, determinate in intensity and in weight, that is, as well as in numbers, declares an action to be right, then that determinate weight of opinion gives to its resolve a political authority, not only civil and temporal, but absolute. Beyond it and above it there is no appeal. In other words, men may justly condemn, and justly have, in 1,000 circumstances condemned, the theory that a mere decision on the major part of the community was necessarily right in morals. It is for that matter self-evident that if one community decides in one fashion, another also sovereign in the opposite fashion, both cannot be right. Reasoning men have also protested, and justly, against the conception that what a majority in numbers, or even what is more compelling still, a unanimity of decision in a community, may order, may not only be wrong, but may be something which that community has no authority to order, since, though it possesses a civil and temporal authority, it acts against that ultimate authority which is its own consciousness of right. Men may and do justly protest against the doctrine that a community is incapable of doing deliberate evil. It is as capable of such an action as is an individual. But men nowhere do or can deny that the community, acting as it thinks right, is ultimately sovereign. There is no alternative to so plain a truth. Let us take it then as indubitable that where civil government is concerned, the community is supreme, if only from the argument that no organ within the community can prove its right to withstand the corporate will, when once that corporate will shall find expression. All arguments which are advanced against this prime axiom of political ethics are, when they are analyzed, found to repose upon a confusion of thought. Thus a man will say, this doctrine would lead my country to abandon her suzerainty over that other nation, but were I to consent to this, I should be weakening my country, to which I owe allegiance. The doctrine compels him to no such muddlement. The community of which he is a member is free to make its dispositions for safety and is bound to preserve its own life. It is for the oppressed to protest and to rebel. Similarly, men think that this doctrine in some way jars with the actual lethargy and actual imbecility of men in their corporate action. It does nothing of the kind. This lethargy, that imbecility, and all the other things that limit the application of the doctrine in no way touch its right reason, any more than the fact that the speech of all men is imperfect contradicts the principle that man has a moral right to self-expression. That a dumb man cannot speak at all, but must write, is so far from a contradiction, a proof of the truth that speech is the prime expression of a man. And in the same way, a community utterly without the power of expressing its corporate will is no contradiction, but a proof of the general rule that such expression and the imposing of such decisions are normal to mankind. The very oddity of the contrast between the abnormal and the normal aids us in our decision, and when we see a people conquered and not persuaded, yet making no attempt at rebellion, or a people free from foreign oppression, yet bewildered at the prospect of self-government, the oddity of the phenomena proves our rule. But though all this be true, there stands against the statement of our political axiom not a contradiction added, but a criticism, and all men with some knowledge of their fellows and of themselves at once perceive, first, that the psychology of corporate action differs essentially from the psychology of individual action, and secondly that, in proportion to the number, the discussions, the lack of intimacy, and in general the friction of the many, corporate action by a community, corporate self-realization, and the imposition of a corporate will varies from the difficult to the impossible. On this no words need be wasted. All men who reason and who observe are agreed that in proportion to distance, numbers, and complexity, the difficulty of self-expression within a community increases. We may get in a lively people explosions of popular will, violent, acute, and certainly real, but rare. We may attempt, with a people more lethargic, to obtain some reflection of popular will through the medium of a permanent machinery of deputation which, less than any other, perhaps permits a great community to express itself truly. We may rely upon the national sympathies of an aristocracy or of a king. But in any case, we know that the large communities can only indirectly and imperfectly express themselves where the permanent government of the whole interest is concerned. Our attachment, which may be passionate to the rights of the common will, we must satisfy either by demanding a loose federation of small self-governing states, or submitting the central government of a large one to occasional insurrection and to violent corporate expression of opinion, which shall readjust the relations between the governor and the governed. All this is true, but such a criticism of the theory in political morals which lay behind the Revolution, the theory that the community is sovereign, is no contradiction. It only tells us that pure right cannot act untrammeled in human affairs, and that it acts in some conditions more laboriously than in others. It gives not a jot of authority to any alternative thesis. Footnote 1. We need not waste any time upon those who talk about such and such a form of government being good because it works. The use of such language connotes that the user of it is fatigued by the effort of thought. For what is working for example, successful action in any sphere, the attainment of certain ends in that sphere. What are those ends in a state? If material well-being, then there is an end to talk of patriotism, the nation, public opinion, and the rest of it, which, as we all very well know, men have always regarded and always will regard as the supreme matters of public interest. If the end is not material well-being, but a sense of political freedom and of the power of the citizen to react upon the state, then to say that an institution works, though apparently not democratic, is simply to say that under such and such conditions that institution achieves the ends of democracy most nearly. In other words, to contrast the good working of an institution superficially undemocratic with democratic theory is meaningless. The institution works in proportion as it satisfies that political sense which perfect democracy would, were it attainable, completely satisfy. The end of section 2. Section 3. The French Revolution. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The French Revolution by Hilaire Belloc. Section 3, Chapter 1, concluded. Such is the general theory of the Revolution, to which the command of Jean-Jacques Rousseau over the French tongue gave imperishable expression in that book whose style and logical connection may be compared to some exact and strong piece of engineering. He entitled it The Contrat Social, and it became the formula of the revolutionary creed. But though no man perhaps has put the prime truth of political morals so well, that truth was as old as the world. It appears in the passionate rhetoric of 100 leaders, and has stood at the head or has been woven into the laws of free states without number. In the English language, the Declaration of Independence is perhaps its noblest expression. And though this document was posterior to the great work of Rousseau, and though the genius of Jefferson was in some part descended from it, its language, and still more the actions of those who drafted and supported it, are sufficient to explain what I mean to the English readers. Now, with this general theory there stands connected on the one hand certain great principles without which it would have no meaning, and also, on the other hand, a number of minor points concerning no more than the machinery of politics. The first are vital to democracy. The second, in spite of their great popularity at the time of the Revolution, and of the sanction which the Revolution gave them, nay, of their universality, since the Revolution have in reality nothing to do with the revolutionary theory itself. Of these two categories, the type of the first is the doctrine of the equality of man. The type of the second is the mere machinery called representative. The doctrine of the equality of the man is a transcendent doctrine, a dogma as we call such doctrines in the field of transcendental religion. It corresponds to no physical reality which we can grasp. It is hardly to be adumbrated even by metaphors drawn from physical objects. We may attempt to rationalize it by saying that what is common to all men is not more important, but infinitely more important than the accident by which men differ. We may compare human attributes to tridimensional and personal attributes to bidimensional measurements. We may say that whatever man has of his nature is all the standards of man, and we may show that in all such things men are potentially equal. None of these metaphors explains the matter. Still less do any of them satisfy the demand of those to whom the dogma may be incomprehensible. Its truth is to be arrived at for these in a negative manner. If men are not equal, then no scheme of jurisprudence, no act of justice, no movement of human indignation, no exaltation of fellowship has any meaning. The doctrine of the equality of man is one which, like many of the great transcendental doctrines, may be proved by the results consequent upon its absence. It is in man to believe it, and all lively societies believe it. It is certainly not in man to prove the equality of men, save, as I have said, by negation. But it demands no considerable intellectual facility to perceive that void of the doctrine of equality. The conception of political freedom and a community's moral right to self-government disappears. Now, to believe that doctrine positively, and to believe it ardently, to go on crusade for that religious point, was indeed characteristic of the French. It required the peculiar and inherited religious temper of the French, which had for so many hundred years seized and defined point after point in the character of man, to grow enamored of this definition and to feel it not in the intellect but as it were in their bones. They became soldiers for it, and that enormous march of theirs overrunning Europe, which may not inaptly be compared to their adventures in the 12th century when they engaged upon the Crusades, was inspired by no one part of the doctrine of political freedom more strongly than by this doctrine of equality. The scorn which was in those days universally felt for that pride which associates itself with the things not inherent to a man, notably and most absurdly with capricious differences of wealth, never ran higher, and the passionate sense of justice which springs from this profound and fundamental social dogma of equality, as it moved France during the Revolution to frenzy, so also moved it to creation. Those who ask how it was that a group of men, sustaining all the weight of civil conflict within and of universal war without, yet made time enough in 20 years to frame the codes which govern modern Europe, to lay down the foundation of universal education, of a strictly impersonal scheme of administration, and even in detail to remodel the material face of society, in a word, to make modern Europe, must be content for their reply to learn that the Republican energy had for its flame and its excitant this vision, a sense almost physical of the equality of man. The minor points which wove themselves into the political practice of democracy during the Revolution, which are not of its principles, and which would not, were they abstracted, affect its essence, are of quite another and less noble kind. I have taken as the chief of these the machinery of deputation or of representation. The representative system had been designed for a particular purpose under the influence of the Church, and especially of the monastic orders who invented it in the Middle Ages. It had been practiced as a useful check upon the national monarchy in France, and as a useful form of national expression in times of crisis, or when national initiative was peculiarly demanded. In Spain it became, as the Middle Ages proceeded, a very vital national and local thing, varying from place to place. It is not surprising that Spain, seeing that in her territory the first experiments in representation were made, should have thus preserved it popular and alive. In England, representation, vigorous as everywhere else in the true Middle Ages, narrowed and decayed at their close, until in the 17th century it had become a mere scheme for aristocratic government. In France, for nearly 200 years before the Revolution, it had fallen into disuse, but an active memory of it still remained, especially a memory of its value in critical moments, when a consultation of the whole people was required, and when the corporate initiative of the whole people must be set at work in order to save the state. It is no wonder, therefore, that the French, on the eve of the Revolution, clamoured for a revival of representation, or, as the system was called in its French tongue, the States General. But as a permanent machine of government, no one in Europe had the least idea how the system might serve the ends of democracy. In England, democracy was not practiced, nor was representation connected with the conception of it. The nation had forgotten democracy as completely as it had forgotten the religion and the old ideals of the Middle Ages. In those parts of Christendom in which this ancient Christian institution of a parliament had not narrowed to be the mask of an oligarchy or dwindled to be a mere provincial custom, its use had disappeared. The ancient function of representation, when it had been most lively and vigorous, that is, in the Middle Ages, was occasionally to initiate a national policy in critical moments, but more generally to grant taxes. What a democratic parliament might do, no one in 1789 could conceive. There was indeed one great example of democratic representation in existence, the example of the United States. But the conditions were wholly different from those of Europe. No true central power yet existed there, no ancient central institution, no crown, nor any custom of the city. The numbers over which American representative democracy then held power were not to be compared to the 25 millions who inhabited the French realm, and even so, most of what counted in their lives was regulated by a system of highly local autonomy, for they were as scattered as they were few, and the wisest and strongest and best were dependent upon slaves. In Europe, I repeat, the experiment was untried, and it is one of the chief faults of the French revolutionaries that, having been compelled in the critical moment of the opening of the Revolution to the use of election and representation, they envisioned the permanent use of a similar machinery as something sacred to and normal in the democratic state. True, they could not foresee modern parliamentarism. Nothing could be more alien to their conception of the state than the deplorable method of government which parliamentarism everywhere tends to introduce today. True, the French people during the Revolutionary Wars made short work of parliamentary theory and found it a more national thing to follow a soldier, being by that time all soldiers themselves, and to incarnate in a dictator the will of the nation. But though the French revolutionaries could not have foreseen what we call parliamentarism today, and though the society from which they sprang made short work of the oligarchic pretensions of a parliament when the realities of the national struggle had to be considered, yet they did, as a fact, pay an almost absurd reverence to the machinery of representation and election. They went so far as to introduce it into their attempted reform of the Church. They introduced it everywhere into civil government, from the smallest units to the highest. They even for a moment played with the illusion in that most real of games which men can ever play at, the business of arms. They allowed the election of officers. They were led to do this by that common fallacy, more excusable in them than in us, which confounds the individual will with the corporate. A representative, they thought, could in some way be the permanent receptacle of his electorate. They imagined that corporate initiative was always sufficiently active, in no matter what divisions or subdivisions, to react at once upon the delegate, to guide him as may be guided by a driven animal, or to command him as may be commanded as a servant. It was in vain that Rousseau, the great exponent of the democratic theory upon which France attempted to proceed, had warned posterity against the possible results of the representative system. They fell into the error, and it possesses many of their descendants to this day. Rousseau's searching mind perceived indeed no more than the general truth that men who consent to a representative system are free only while the representatives are not sitting. But as is so often the case with institutions of genius, though he saw not the whole of the evil, he had put his finger upon its central spot, and from that main and just principle which he laid down, that under a merely representative system men cannot be really free, flow all those evils which we now know to attach to this method of government. What a rather clumsy epigram has called the audacity of elected persons is part of this truth. The evident spectacle of modern parliamentary nations driven against their will into economic conditions which appall them proceeds again from the same truth. The conspicuous and hearty contempt into which parliamentary institutions have everywhere fallen again proceeds from it, and there proceeds from it that further derivative plague, that the representatives themselves have now everywhere become more servile than the electorate, and that in all parliamentary countries a few intriguers are the unworthy depositories of power, and by their service of finance permit the money dealers to govern us all today. Rousseau, I say, the chief prophet of the Revolution, had warned the French of this danger. It is a capital example of his talent, for the experiment of democratic representation had not yet in his time been tried, but which much more is that power of his by which he not only stamped and issued the gold of democracy as it had never till then been minted. No one man makes a people or their creed, but Rousseau more than any other man made vocal the creed of a people, and it is advisable or necessary for the reader of the Revolution to consider at the outset of his reading of what nature was Rousseau's abundant influence upon the men who remodeled the society of Europe between 1789 and 1794. Why did he dominate those 5 years, and how was it that he dominated them increasingly? An explanation of Rousseau's power merits a particular digression, for few who express themselves in the English tongue have cared to understand it, and in the academies provincial men have been content to deal with this great writer as though he were in some way inferior to themselves. The end of section 3. The end of chapter 1. Section 4. The French Revolution. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The French Revolution by Hilaire Belloc. Section 4, Chapter 2, Rousseau. In order to appreciate what Rousseau meant to the revolutionary movement, it is necessary to consider the effect of style upon men. Men are influenced by the word, spoken or written. The word is the organ of persuasion and therefore of moral government. Now, degraded as that term has become in our time, there is no proper term to express the exact use of words save the term style. What words we use and in what order we put them is the whole matter of style, and a man desiring to influence his fellow men has therefore not one but two co-related instruments at his disposal. He cannot use one without the other. The weakness of the one will ruin the other. These two instruments are his idea and his style. However powerful, native, sympathetic to his hearer's mood, or cogently provable by reference to new things may be a man's idea, he cannot persuade his fellow men to it if he have not the words that express it, and he will persuade them more and more in proportion as his words are well chosen and in the right order, such order being determined by the genius of the language whence they are drawn. Whether the idea of which Rousseau made himself the exponent in his famous tract be true or false need not further concern us in this little book. We all know that the difficult attempt to realize political freedom has attracted various communities of men at various times and repelled others. What English readers rarely hear is that the triumph of Rousseau depended not only on the first element in persuasion, which is vision, but also upon the second of the two co-related instruments by which a man may influence his fellows, to wit, style. It was his choice of French words and the order in which he arranged them that gave him his enormous ascendancy over the generation which was young when he was old. I have alluded to his famous tract, The Contrat Social, and here a second point concerning it may be introduced. This book, which gave a text for the Revolution, the document to which its political theory could refer, was by no means, as foreign observers have sometimes imagined, the whole body of writing for which Rousseau was responsible. To imagine that is to make the very common error of confusing a man with his books. Rousseau wrote on many things. His character was of an exalted, nervous and diseased sort. Its excessive sensibility degenerated with the advancing years into something not distinguishable from mania. He wrote upon education, and the glory of his style carried conviction, both where he was right and where the short experience of 100 years has proved him to have been wholly wrong. He wrote upon love, and half the lessons to be drawn from his writing will be condemned by the saying. He wrote upon botany at vast length. He wrote also upon music, with what success in either department I am incompetent to determine. He wrote upon human inequality, and though the sentences were beautiful and the sentiment just, the analysis was very insufficient, and the historical conception bad. He wrote upon a project for perpetual peace which was rubbish, and he wrote upon the government of Poland an essay which was a perfect masterpiece. But when a great writer writes, each of his great writings has a life of its own. And it was not any of these other writings of Rousseau on love or botany which were the text of the Revolution. The text of the Revolution was his Contrat Social. Now, it is not too much to say that never in the history of political theory has a political theory been put forward so lucidly, so convincingly, so tersely, or so accurately as in this short and wonderful book. The modern publisher in this country would be ashamed to print it, not for its views, which would now seem commonplace, nor for its excellence, which would ensure it a failure, but for its brevity. It is as short as a gospel, and would cover but 100 pages of one of our serious reviews. A modern publisher in this city would not know what price to set upon such a work, and the modern reader in this country would be puzzled to understand how a great thing could be got within so narrow a compass. A debate in Parliament, or the libretto of a long pantomime, is of greater volume. Nevertheless, if it be closely read, the Contrat Social will be discovered to say all that can be said of the moral basis of democracy. Our ignorance of the historical basis of the state is presumed in the very opening lines of it. The logical priority of the family to the state is the next statement. The ridiculous and shameful argument that strength is the basis of authority, which has never had standing save among the uninstructed or the superficial, is contemptuously dismissed in a very simple proof which forms the third chapter. And that chapter is not a page of a book in length. It is with the fifth chapter that the powerful argument begins, and the logical precedence of human association to any particular form of government is the foundation stone of that analysis. It is this indeed which gives its title to the book. The moral authority of men in community arises from conscious association, or, as an exact phraseology would have it, a social contract. All the business of democracy, as based upon the only moral authority in a state, follows from this first principle, and is developed in Rousseau's extraordinary achievement, which much more than any other writing, not religious, has affected the destiny of mankind. It is indeed astonishing to one who is well acquainted not only with the matter but with the manner of the Contrat Social to remark what criticisms have been passed on it by those who have not read the work, or, having read it, did so with an imperfect knowledge of the meaning of French words. The two great counter-arguments, the one theoretic and the other practical, which democracy has to meet, stand luminously exposed in these pages, though in so short a treatise the author might have been excused from considering them. The theoretical argument against democracy is, of course, that, man being prone to evil, something external to him and indifferent to his passions must be put up to govern him. The people will corrupt themselves. But a despot or an oligarchy, when it has satisfied its corrupt desires, still has a wide margin over which it may rule well, because it is indifferent. You cannot bribe the despot or the oligarch beyond the limit of his own desires. But a whole people can follow its own corrupt desires to the full, and they will infect all government. The full practice of democracy, therefore, says Rousseau, is better suited to angels than to men. As to the practical argument that men are not sufficiently conscious of the state to practice democracy, save in small communities, that plea also is recognized and stated better than anyone else has stated it. For there is not in this book an apology for democracy as a method of government, but a statement of why and how democracy is right. The silly confusion which regards a representative method as essentially democratic has never been more contemptuously dealt with, nor more thoroughly than in the few words in which the Contrat Social dismisses it forever, though it was left to our own time to discover, in the school of unpleasant experience, how right was Rousseau in this particular condemnation. Exiguous as are the limits within which the great writer has finally decided the theory of democracy, he finds space for side issues which nowhere else but in this book had been orderly considered, and which, when once one has heard them mentioned, one sees to be of the most excellent wisdom: that the fundamental laws or original and particular bonds of a new democracy must come from a source external to itself; that as to the nature of the people for whom one is legislating, however democratic the form of the state, we must conform the particulars of law; that a democracy cannot live without tribunes; that no utterly inflexible law can be permitted in the state, and hence the necessity for dictatorship in exceptional times; that no code can foresee future details, and so forth. It would be a legitimate and entertaining task to challenge any man who had not read the Contrat Social, and this would include most academic writers upon the treatise, to challenge any such one, I say, to put down an argument against democratic theory which could not be found within these few pages, or to suggest a limitation of it which Rousseau had not touched on. If proof were needed of what particular merits this pamphlet displayed, it would be sufficient to point out that in a time when the problem represented by religion was least comprehended, when the practice of religion was at its lowest, and when the meaning almost of religion had left men's minds, Rousseau was capable of writing his final chapter. That great religious revival of the 19th century should have proved Rousseau's view of religion in the state to be insufficient, is in no way remarkable, for when Rousseau wrote, that revival was undreamt of. What is remarkable is that he should have allowed as he did for the religious sentiment, and above all that he should have seen how impossible it is for a selection of Christian dogma to be accepted as a civic religion. It is further amazing that at such a time a man could be found who should appreciate that for the state to have unity it must possess a religion, and Rousseau's attempt to define that minimum or substratum of religion without which unity could not exist in the state unfortunately became the commonplace of the politicians, and particularly of the English politicians who succeeded him. Who might not think, for instance, that he was reading, though better expressed, of course, than a politician would put it, some liberal politician at Westminster, if he were to come on such phrases as these with regard to what should be taught in the schools of the country. Quote, "The doctrines taught by the state should be simple, few in number, expressed with precision and without explanation or commentary. The existence of a powerful God, beneficent, providential and good, the future life, the happiness of the good and the punishment of evil, the sanctity of the agreements which bind society together and of laws, while as for negative doctrines one is sufficient, and that one is the wickedness of intolerance." End quote. Rousseau's 100 pages are the direct source of the theory of the modern state. Their lucidity and unmatched economy of diction, their rigid analysis, their epigrammatic judgment and wisdom, these are the reservoirs from whence modern democracy has flowed. What are now proved to be the errors of democracy are errors against which the Contrat Social warned men. The moral apology of democracy is the moral apology written by Rousseau. And if in this one point of religion he struck a more confused and a less determined note than in the rest, it must be remembered that in his time no other man understood what part religion played in human affairs, for in his days the few who studied religion and observed it could not connect it in any way with the political nature of man, and of those who counted in the intellect of Europe. By far the greater number thought political problems better solved if religion, which they had lost, were treated as negligible. They were wrong, and Rousseau, in his generalities upon the soul, was insufficient. Both were beneath the height of a final theory of man. But Rousseau came much nearer to comprehension, even in this point of religion, than did any of his contemporaries. The end of section 4, the end of chapter 2. Section 5, The French Revolution. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The French Revolution by Hilaire Belloc. Section 5, Chapter 3, Characters of the Revolution, King Louis XVI. As might be expected, the character of Louis XVI has suffered more distortion at the hands of historians than has any other of the revolutionary figures, and this because he combined with that personal character of his a certain office, to which were traditionally attached certain points of view and methods of action, which the historian takes for granted when he deals with the character of the man. As anyone thinking of a judge of some standing upon the English bench cannot but believe that he is possessed of some learning or some gravity, etc., as anyone hearing of a famous soldier cannot but believe that he has certain qualities associated with the business of soldiering, so historians tend to confuse the personality and the character of Louis XVI with that of his office. They either by contrast exaggerate his unkingly defects, or by sympathy exaggerate his kingly opposition to reform. The student will do well to avoid this error and its source, and to think of Louis as of a man who had been casually introduced, almost without preparation, into the office which he held. In other words, the student will do well in his reading of the Revolution to consider Louis XVI simply as a man, and his character as a private character. For this last of the long, unbroken line of the Capetians possessed a character essentially individual. It was of a type which, no matter what accidents of fortune might have fallen upon its possessor, would have remained the same. Nor was ever a man possessed of high office whom high office had less moulded. Men thus impervious to their environment are commonly so from two causes: either from an intense and vivid personal initiative which may border upon madness, or from something thick and heavy in their moral accoutrement which defends against external action the internal personal temperament. The latter was the case with Louis. He was very slow of thought and very slow of decision. His physical movements were slow. The movement of his eyes was notably slow. He had a way of falling asleep under the effort of fatigue at the most incongruous moments. The things that amused him were of the largest and most superficial kind. Horseplay, now and then a little touched with eccentricity, and very plain but unexpected jokes. One may express him from one aspect by saying that he was one of those men whom you could never by any chance have hoped to convince of anything. The few things which he accepted quite simply, and the process of reasoning in the mouth of any who approached him was always too rapid for him to follow. But it must not be imagined on this account that the moral integument so described was wrapped about a void. On the contrary, it enclosed a very definite character. Louis possessed a number of intimate convictions upon which he was not to be shaken. He was profoundly convinced of the existence and value of certain corporate tradition in the organism which he ruled, the French nation. He was a national. In this he differed from many a pedant, many a courtier, many an ecclesiastic, and many a woman about him, especially his wife. He was again possessed of all the elements of the Catholic faith. It was indeed a singular thing for a man of his position at such a time to hold intimately to religion, but Louis held to it. He confessed, he communicated, he attended Mass, he performed his ordinary devotions, not by way of tradition or political duty or state function to which religious performance was now reduced in the vast majority of his wealthy contemporaries, but as an individual for whom these things had a personal value. Had he, with precisely the same interior spirit, woken in his bed some morning to find himself a country squire, and to discover that all his past kingship had been a dream of the night, he would have continued the practice of his religion as before. Now this is a sufficiently remarkable point for the country squire, the noble, the lawyer, the university professor of the generation immediately preceding the Revolution had, as a rule, no conception of the Catholic Church. With them the faith was dead, save in the case of a very few who made it, if one may say so without disrespect, a mania, and in their exaggerations were themselves the proofs of the depth of decay into which the Church of Gaul had fallen. Louis XVI was possessed, then, of religion. It appeared in many of his acts, in his hesitation to appoint not a few of his many atheist bishops of the time, in his real agony of responsibility upon the civil constitution of the clergy, and in nothing more than the peculiar sobriety and solid ritual whereby he prepared for a tragic, sudden, and ignominious death. It is next to be observed that though he was a man not yet in middle age, and though he was quite devoid of ardour in any form, he had from the first matured a great basis of courage. It is well to admit that this quality in him was connected with those slow processes of thought and action which hampered him, but it is not to be explained by them. No man yet has become brave through mere stupidity. It was not only the accidents of the Revolution that provided this quality in him. His physical habits proved it long before. He was a resolute and capable rider of the horse. An aptitude in that exercise is impossible to the coward. Again, in those by-products of courage which are apparent, even where no physical danger threatens, he was conspicuous. He had no hesitation in facing a number of men, and he had an aptitude in a mechanical trade, a business by no means unconnected with virility. Now, in mentioning his virility, it is of prime importance for the student to remember, though the matter can be touched upon but lightly, that Louis in this department of physical life suffered from a mechanical impediment which gravely distorted the first years of his marriage, which undoubtedly wounded his self-respect, and which was perhaps the only thing that caused him permanent anxiety. He was cured by medical aid in the summer of the year 1777, but he was already 3 years a king and 7 years a husband before that relief came to him. The tragedy affected his whole life, and I repeat, must never be forgotten when one considers either him or Marie Antoinette in their intimate character and in their effect as actors in the great drama. For the rest, the character of Louis betrayed certain ineptitudes. The word ineptitude is far more accurate in this connection than the word weaknesses, which ineptitudes were particularly fatal for the military office which he held and for the belligerent crisis which he had to meet. Few men are possessed of the eye, the subtle sympathy, the very rapid power of decision, and the comprehension of human contrasts and differences which build up the apt leader of an armed force, great or small. Most men are mediocre in the combination of these qualities, but Louis was quite exceptionally hopeless where they were concerned. He could never have seen the simplest position, nor have appreciated the military aspects of any character or of any body of men. He could ride, but he could not ride at the head of a column. He was not merely bad at this trade, he was null. Drafted as a private into a conscript army, he would never have been entrusted with the duties of a corporal. It would have been impossible as a sergeant. And possessed of commissioned rank, ridicule would have compelled him to take his discharge. This lack did not only or chiefly betray itself in his inability to meet personally the armed crisis of a revolution. It was not only or chiefly apparent in his complete breakdown during the assault upon the palace in the 10th of August. It was also, and much more, the disastrous cause of his inability to oversee or even to choose military advisers. Those who propose in the early part of the Revolution to check the mob in Paris are excellent commanders, but Louis does not know it. Those who succeed each other at the Ministry of War or at the head of the armies during the active part of the Revolution are various in the extreme, but they all seem one to him. Between a fop like Narbonne and a subtle, trained cavalryman like Dumouriez, Louis made no distinction. The military qualities of Lafayette, which were not to be despised, meant no more to him than does music, good or bad, to a deaf man. From the beginning to the end of the movement, the whole of the military problem escaped him. Another hole in his character, which was of prime importance at such a time, was his inability to grasp in a clear vision any general social problem. Maps he could well comprehend, and he could well retain statistics. But the landscape, as it were, of the Revolution, his protuberant and lethargic eyes completely missed. He was quite unable to see where lay danger and where support, in what large masses such and such forces were grouped, and the directions in which they were advancing or upon which they must retreat. In this matter he was, as will be seen in a moment, the very opposite of Mirabeau, and it was on account of this weakness, or rather this form of nullity, that all Mirabeau's vision was wasted upon Louis. Finally, he had no working comprehension of Europe. He did not even exaggerate the powers of the Allies in the later phases of the Revolution, when they were marching upon France. He did not either underestimate or overestimate the policy and naval force of Great Britain, the military resources of his own subjects, the probable sympathies of the Netherlands, anti-Austrian but Catholic, the decay of Spain, the division and impotence of the Italian peninsula. Louis saw nothing of all these things. One may conclude the picture, for the purposes of such a short study as this, by saying that only one coincidence could have led him through the labyrinth of the time with success. That coincidence would have been the presence at his side of a friend fully trusted from childhood, loved, as religious as himself, and yet possessing precisely those qualities which he himself lacked. Had Louis found to hand such a lieutenant, the qualities I have mentioned would have been a sort of keel and ballast which would have secured the monarchy, for he was not weak, he was not impulsive, he was not even foolish. He was only wretchedly alone in his incapacities. Certainly such a nature could trust and rely upon no one who was not of this intimate kind, and he possessed no such intimate, let alone an intimate who could command the qualities I have suggested. Being what he was, his character is among the half dozen which determined the Revolution to take the course which it did. The end of section 5. Section 6. The French Revolution. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The French Revolution by Hilaire Belloc. Section 6, Chapter 3, continued. The Queen. Marie Antoinette presents to history a character which it is of the highest interest to regard as a whole. It is the business of her biographers to consider that character as a whole. But in her connection with the Revolution there is but one aspect of it which is of importance, and that is the attitude which such a character was bound to take towards the French nation, in the midst of which the Queen found herself. It is the solution of the whole problem which the Queen's action sets before us, to apprehend the gulf that separated her not only from the French temperament, but from a comprehension of all French society. Had she been a woman lacking in energy or in decision, this alien character in her would have been a small matter, and her ignorance of the French in every form of their activity, or rather her inability to comprehend them, would have been but a private failing, productive only of certain local and immediate consequences, and not in any way determining the great lines of the revolutionary movement. As it was, her energy was not only abundant, but steadfast. It grew more secure in its action as it increased with her years, and the initiative which gave that energy its course never vacillated, but was always direct. She knew her own mind, and she attempted often, with a partial success, to realize her convictions. There was no character in touch with the executive during the first years of the Revolution comparable to hers for fixity of purpose and definition of view. It was due to this energy and singleness of aim that her misunderstanding of the material with which she had to deal was of such fatal importance. It was she who chose, before the outbreak of the Revolution, the succession of those ministers, both liberal and reactionary, whose unwise plans upon either side precipitated violence. It was she who called and then revoked and later recalled to office the wealthy and overestimated Necker, she who substituted for him and then so inappropriately threw over Calonne, the most national of the precursors of the Revolution, and ever after her most bitter enemy. It was she who advised the more particularly irritating details of resistance after the meeting of the first revolutionary parliament. It was she who presided over and helped to warp the plans for the flight of the royal family. It was she who, after this flight had failed, framed a definite scheme for the coercion of the French people by the governments of Europe. It was she who betrayed to foreign chanceries the French plan of campaign when war had become inevitable. Finally, it was she who inspired the Declaration of Brunswick, which accompanied the invasion of French territory, and she was in particular the author of the famous threat therein contained to give over Paris to military execution and to hold all the popular authorities responsible with their lives for the restoration of the pre-revolutionary state of affairs. As research proceeds, the capital effect of this woman's continual and decided interference will be more and more apparent to historians. Now, Marie Antoinette's conception of mankind in general was the conception that you will find prevalent in such societies as that domestic and warm centre which had nourished her childhood, the romantic affection of a few equals, the personal loyalty of a handful of personal servants, the vague histrionic content which permeates the poor at the sight of great equipages and rich accoutrements, the cheers of a crowd when such symbols accompanying monarchy are displayed in the streets. All these were for Marie Antoinette the fundamental political feelings of mankind. An absence of them she regarded with bewilderment. An active opposition to them she hated as something at once incomprehensible and positively evil. There was in all this illusion, of course, a great element of what the English call middle class and the French bourgeois. To be quite ignorant of what servitors will say of their masters behind their backs, not to appreciate that heroic devotion is the faculty of a few, never to have imagined the discontents of men in general and the creative desire for self-expression which inspires men when they act politically, not to know that men as a whole, and particularly the French people, are not deceived by the accidents of wealth, nor attach any real inferiority to poverty, to despise the common will of numbers, or to doubt its existence, to see society established in a hierarchy not of office but of leisure. All this may seem to the democrat a very unnatural and despicable mood. But it was not despicable, still less unnatural, in the case of Marie Antoinette. It was the only experience and the only conception of society which had ever been given her. She had always believed, when she gazed upon a mass of the populace, that the difference between the crowd and herself was a moral reality. The contrast in external habits between the wealthy, the middle class, and the poor, a contrast ultimately produced by differences in the opportunity and leisure which wealth affords, she thought to be fundamental. Just as children and certain domestics, pet animals, regard such economic accidents in society as something real which differentiates men, so did she. But she happened to nourish this illusion in the midst of a people, and within a day's walk of a capital, where the misconception had less hold than in any other district of Europe. Of the traits peculiar to the French, she knew nothing. Or to put it more strongly, she could not believe that they really existed. The extremes of cruelty into which this people could fall were inconceivable to her, as were also the extremes of courage to which they can rise under the same excitements as arouse them to an excess of hatred. But that character in the French which she most utterly failed to foresee or to comprehend was their power of corporate organization. That a multitude could instruct and order themselves for a common purpose, rapidly acquire and nominate the officers who should bring that purpose to fruition, and in general pass in one moment from a mere multitude to an incipient army, that was a faculty which the French had always had and have to a peculiar degree, and which she, like so many of our own contemporaries, and especially those of German blood, could not believe to be real. This faculty in the French, when it took action and was apparent in the physical struggles of the Revolution, seemed to her to the very end a sort of nightmare, something which by all the laws of reality ought not to be happening, but somehow or other was happening in a manner evilly miraculous. It was her ignorance upon this main point of all that caused her to rely so continually upon the use of regular forces, and of those forces in insufficient numbers. She could not but believe that a few trained soldiery were necessarily the masters of great civilian bodies. Their uniforms were a powerful argument with her, and mere civilian bodies, however numerous, were always in her conception a dust of disparate and inchoate community. She believed there was nothing to attack or resist in popular numbers but the opinion, the fear, or the cupidity of the individual. In this error of judgment concerning the French people, she was not peculiar. It is an error repeated over and over again by foreigners, and even by some native commentators when they seek to account for some national movement of the Gauls. The unlearning of it is the first lesson which those who would either administrate or resist the French should learn. In the matter of religion, which the reader may see in these pages to be of such moment in the revolutionary story, the Queen was originally far more indifferent than her husband, though she observed a certain measure of personal practice. It was not until her heavy misfortunes came upon her that any degree of personal devotion appeared in her daily life, though it must be admitted that by a sort of premonition of disaster she turned to religion in the months immediately preceding the outbreak of the Reform. It remains to describe the personal effect she had upon those who were in her immediate presence. Most of the French aristocracy she repelled. The same misfortune which made her unable to understand the French temperament as a whole divorced her from that particular corner of it, which took the shape of French aristocratic tradition. She did not understand its stiffness, its exactitude, its brilliancy, or its hardness, and she heartily disliked all four. On this account, she produced in the great families of her court, and especially upon the women of them, an effect of vulgarity. Had she survived, and had her misfortunes not been so tragic in intensity, the legend she would have left in French society would certainly have been one of off-handed carelessness, self-indulgence, and lack of dignity, which have for the French of that rank the savour of a loud voice, a bad accent, and an insufficient usage in the rules of daily conduct leave upon what is left of a corresponding rank in England today. She was, on the other hand, easily deceived by the flattery of place seekers, and the great power which she wielded in politics just before the Revolution broke out made her, as it were, a sort of butt of the politicians. They haunted her presence, they depended upon her patronage, and at the same time they secretly ridiculed her. Her carriage, which was designed to impress onlookers, and did have that effect upon most foreigners, seemed to most of the French observers, of a rank which permitted them to approach her familiarly, somewhat theatrical and sometimes actually absurd. The earnestness which she displayed in several lines of conduct, and notably in her determined animosity to certain characters, as that of Lafayette for instance, was of an open and violent sort which seemed to them merely brutal and unintelligent. Her luxury, moreover, was noticed by the refined world of Versailles to be hardly ever of her own choosing, but nearly always practiced in imitation of others. In connection with that trait of luxury, the reader must appreciate at the outset that it was grievously exaggerated by her contemporaries, and has been still more exaggerated by posterity. She was not a very frivolous, still less a dissipated woman. She was woefully loose in tongue, but she was certainly virtuous. She gambled, but as the times went, and the supposed unlimited fortune of the Crown, her gambling was not often excessive. Her expenditure upon jewellery and dress would be thought most moderate today in the case of any lady of our wealthier families. On the other hand, her whims were continual and as continually changing, especially in the earlier part of her life. Since that surrounding world of the court which she misunderstood, and which had no sympathy with her, was ready to find some handle against her, that handle of dissipation was the easiest for them to seize, but the accusation was not a just one. Had fortune made her the wife of a poor man in a lower class of society, Marie Antoinette would have been a capable housewife. Her abundant energy would have found a proper channel, and she was in no way by nature extravagant. She had a few very passionate, somewhat too sentimental friendships, some of which were returned, others of which their objects exploited to their own advantage. The two most famous were her friendship for the Princess de Lamballe and for Madame de Polignac. These moved her not infrequently to unwise acts of patronage which were immediately seized by the popular voice and turned against her. They were among the few weaknesses apparent in her general temper. They were certainly ill-balanced and ill-judged. She indulged also in a number of small and unimportant flirtations which might almost be called the routine of her rank and world. She had but one great affection in her life for the other sex, and it was most ardently returned. Its object was a Swedish noble of her own age, the very opposite of the French in his temper, romantically chivalrous, unpractical in the extreme, gentle, intensely reserved. His name, Count Axel de Fersen. The affair remained pure, but she loved him with her whole heart, and in the last months of her tragedy this emotion must be regarded as the chief concern of her soul. They saw each other but very rarely, often they were separated for years. It was this, perhaps, which lent both glamour and fidelity to the strange romance. The end of section 6. Section 7. The French Revolution. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The French Revolution by Hilaire Belloc. Section 7, Chapter 3, continued. Mirabeau. Mirabeau, the chief of the practical men of the Revolution, as the English language would render the most salient point in their political attitude, needs a very particular examination. His influence upon the early part of the Revolution was so considerable, the effect of his death was so determinate and final, the speculation as to what might have happened had he survived is so fruitful, so entertaining and so common, and the positive effect of his attitude upon the development of the Revolution after his death was so wide, that to misunderstand Mirabeau is in a large measure to misunderstand the whole movement. And Mirabeau has unfortunately been ill or superficially understood by many among now 3 generations of historians. For a comprehension of this character is not a matter for research nor for accumulated historic detail, but rather a task for sympathy. Mirabeau was essentially an artist with the powers and the frailties which we properly associate with that term. That is, strong emotion appealed to him both internally and externally. He loved to enjoy it himself. He loved to create it in others. He studied, therefore, and was a master of, the material by which such emotion may be created. He himself yielded to strong emotion and sought it where it might be found. It is foolish alike to belittle and to exaggerate this type of temperament. Upon it, or upon its admixture with other qualities, is based the music, the plastic art, and in a large measure the permanent literature of the world. This aptitude for the enjoyment and for the creation in others of emotion clothes intellectual work in a manner which makes it permanent. This is what we mean when we say that style is necessary to a book, that a great civilization may partly be judged by its architecture, that, as Plato says, music may be moral or immoral, and so forth. The artist, though he is not at the root of human affairs, is a necessary and proper ally in their development. When I say that Mirabeau was an artist, I mean that wherever his energies might have found play, he would have there desired to enjoy and to create enjoyment through some definite medium. This medium was in part literary, but much more largely oral expression. To be a tribune, that is, the voice of great numbers, to persuade, nay, to please by his very accents and the very rhythm of his sentences, these things occupied the man. But he also brought into his art that without which no great art can exist, mere intellect. He believed in the main principles, at least, which underlay the revolutionary movement. He understood them and was prepared to propagate them. But his power over men was not due to this conviction. His power over men was wholly that of the artist, and had he by some accident been engaged in maintaining the attack against democracy, he would have been nearly as famous as he became under the title of its defender. We must then always consider Mirabeau as an orator, though as an orator endowed with a fine and clear intelligence and with no small measure of reasoned faith. Much else remains to be said of him. He was a gentleman. That is, he both enjoyed and suffered the consequences which attach to hereditary wealth and to the atmosphere that surrounds its expenditure. On this account, he being personally insufficiently provided with wealth, he was forever in debt, and regarded the sums necessary to his station in life and to his large opportunities as things due to him, so to speak, from society. We are right when we may say he took bribes, but wrong if we imagine that those bribes bound him as they would bind a man meaner in character or less lucky in his birth. He stooped, as gentlemen will, to all manner of low intrigues to obtain the necessary and the wherewith, that is, money, for his role. But there was a driving power behind him, bound up with his whole character, which made it impossible for any such sums to control his diction or to make of such a man a mere advocate. He was never that dirtiest of political phenomena, the party man. He would never have been had he been born 100 years later and thrust into the nastiness of modern parliamentary life, a parliamentary hand. Mirabeau had behind him a certain personal history which we must read in connection with his temperament. He had travelled widely. He knew Englishmen and Germans of the wealthier classes well. The populace he knew ill, even in his own country. Abroad he knew it not at all. He had suffered from his father's dislike of him, from the consequences of his own unbridled passions, also not a little from mere accidental misfortune. Capable of prolonged and faithful attachment to some woman, the opportunity for that attachment had never been afforded him until the last few months before his death. Capable of paying loyal and industrious service to some political system, no political system had chosen him for its servant. It is a fruitful matter of speculation to consider what he might have done for the French monarchy had fate put him early at court and given him some voice in the affairs of the French executive before the Revolution broke out. As it was, the Revolution provided him with his opportunity, merely because it broke down old barriers and conventions and was destructive of the framework of the state in which he lived. He was compelled to enter the Revolution as something of a destroyer, for by no other avenue could he be given his chance. But by nature he detested destruction. I mean, since this phrase is somewhat vague, he detested that spirit which will disendow a nation of certain permanent institutions serving definite ends, without a clear scheme of how those institutions should be replaced by others to serve similar ends. It was on this account that he was most genuinely and sincerely a defender of the monarchy, a permanent institution serving the definite ends of national unity and the repression of tendencies to oligarchy in the state. Mirabeau had none of the revolutionary vision. In mind he was prematurely aged, for his mind had worked very rapidly over a very varied field of experiences. The pure doctrine of democracy, which was a religion to many of his contemporaries, with all the consequences of a religion, he had never thought of accepting. But certain consequences of the proposed reform strongly appealed to him. He loved to be rid of meaningless and dead barriers, privileges which no longer corresponded to real social differences, old traditions in the management of trade which no longer corresponded to the economic circumstances of his time. And this is the pivotal point: the fossils of an old religious creed which, like nearly all his rank, he simply took for granted to be dead. For Mirabeau was utterly divorced from the Catholic Church. Much has been said and will be said in these pages concerning the religious quarrel which, though men hardly knew it at the time, cut right across the revolutionary effort and was destined to form the lasting line of cleavage in French life. There will be repeated again and again what has already been written, that a reconciliation between a Catholic Church and the reconstruction of democracy was, though men did not know it, the chief temporal business of the time, and the reader of these pages will be made well acquainted in them with the degradation to which religion had fallen among the cultivated of that generation. But in the case of Mirabeau, this absence of religion must be particularly insisted upon. It would no more have occurred to Mirabeau that the Catholic faith had a future than it could occur to us, let us say, an English politician of 30 years ago, that the Irish might become a wealthy community, or that an English government might within its own lifetime find itself embarrassed for money. I use this parallel for the sake of strengthening my contention, but it is indeed a weak parallel. No contemporary parallel in our strange and rapidly changing times corresponds to the fixed certitude which permeated the whole of the end of the 18th century that the Catholic faith was dead. Mirabeau had perhaps never engaged in his life in intimate conversations a single man who took the Catholic sacraments seriously or suffered a moment's anxiety upon the tenets of the creed. He knew indeed that certain women and a much smaller number of insignificant men wrapped themselves up in old practices of an odd superstitious kind. He knew that great dull areas of ignorant peasantry, in proportion to their poverty and isolation, repeated by rote the old formula of the faith. But of the faith as a living thing he could have no conception. He saw on the one hand a clerical institution, economic in character, providing places and revenues for men of his own rank. He met those men and never discovered them to have any religion at all. He saw on the other hand a proposed society in which such a fossil, unjust and meaningless, must relinquish its grip upon those large revenues. But the faith as a social force, as a thing able to revive, he could have no conception. It would have seemed to him a mere folly to suggest that future might contain the possibility of such a resurrection. The dissolution of the religious orders, which was largely his work, the civil constitution of the clergy which he presided over, were to him the most natural acts in the world. They were the mere sweeping away of a quantity of inorganic stuff which cumbered the modern state. He felt of them as we might feel of the purchase of waste spaces in our cities, or the confiscation of some bad landlord's property in them. The Church served no kind of purpose. Not one who counted believed in it. It was defended only by people who enjoyed large revenues from the survival of what had once been, but was now no longer, a living social function. In everything of the Revolution which he understood, Mirabeau was upon the side of caution. He was not oblivious to the conception of popular government. He was not even mistrustful of it, but he could not conceive of it save as acting through the established strength of the wealthier classes. Of military power he judged very largely through Prussian eyes, and in long and enthusiastic passages he described the Prussian army as invincible. Had he lived to see the military enthusiasm of the Republicans, he would utterly have distrusted it. He favoured in his heart an aristocratic machinery of society, though not an aristocratic theory of the state. He was quite determined to preserve, as a living but diminished national organ, the traditional monarchy of France. He was curious upon a number of details which were present and close to his eyes: methods of voting, constitutional checks, commercial codes, and the rest of it. The little equilibriums of diplomacy interested him also, and the watching of men immediately under his eye in the Parliament. It was in the Parliament that his whole activity lay. It was there that he began to guide the Revolution. It was his absence from the Parliament after his death that the Revolution most feels in the summer of 1791. This very brief sketch does not present Mirabeau to the reader. He can only be properly presented in his speeches and in the more rhetorical of his documents. It is probable, as time proceeds, that his reputation in this department will grow. His constitutional ideas, based as they were upon foreign institutions, and especially upon the English of that time, were not applicable to his own people, and are now nearly forgotten. He was wrong upon English politics, as he was wrong upon the German armies, but he had art over men, and his personality endures and increases with time. The end of section 7. Section 8. The French Revolution. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The French Revolution by Hilaire Belloc. Section 8. Chapter 3 continued. Lafayette. The character of Lafayette has suffered chiefly from his own aloofness towards contemporaries on the one hand, and from his rigid adherence to principle upon the other. Both these causes are clearly connected. The same quality in him which made him so tenacious of principle made him contemptuous of the run of men about him. Fundamentally, he was nearer the extreme Republicans than any other class, from the very fact of his possessing a clear political creed and a determination to follow it out to its logical consequence. But there was no chance of his comprehending the concrete side of the movement, or the men engaged upon it, for his great wealth, inherited in very early life, had cut him off from experience. His moral fault was undoubtedly ambition. It was an ambition which worked in the void, as it were, and never measured itself with other men's capacities or opportunities. He made no plans for advancement, not because he would have despised the use of intrigue and reason, but because he was incapable of working it. He was exceedingly attached to popularity. When it came, he thought it his due. Unpopularity, in its turn, seemed to him a proof of the vileness of those who despised him. He made himself too much the measure of his world. Undoubtedly, a very great part of the moulding of his character proceeds from his experience in the United States of America. He was then at the most impressionable and formative period of human life, little more than a boy, or at least just entering early manhood. He had just married, he had just come into the administration of his vast fortune. At such a moment he took part in the victorious rebellion of the English colonies, and it may be imagined how powerful was the effect of this youthful vision upon the whole of the man's future life, because there was no proletariat in the colonies. He never saw or comprehended the dispossessed classes of Paris. For that matter, he never saw or comprehended the French peasantry upon his own lands, because a chance and volunteer soldiery had, under the peculiar conditions of the half-populated Atlantic seaboard, in conjunction with the French fleet and with the aid of French money and arms, got the better of the small and heterogeneous forces of George III. He believed that a military nation like the French, in the midst of powerful enemies, could make something of an amateur civic force, because a certain type of ease in social relations was the ideal of many, perhaps of most, of those whom he had served in America. He confused so simple and mundane an ideal with the fierce crusading blast and the sacred passion for equality which was stirring his own nation when his opportunity for leadership came. It may be said of Lafayette with justice that he never upon a single occasion did the right thing. It may also be said with justice that he never did politically any major thing for which his own conscience would later reproach him. It is not noticeable that the Queen held him in particular odium. He had been a wealthy young noble about the court, the friend of all her women friends, and his sympathy with the revolutionary movement at its inception therefore seemed to her nothing better than treason. There was also undoubtedly something in his manner which grievously repelled her. That it was self-sufficient we cannot doubt. That it was so often futile and therefore exasperating to women, events are sufficient to show. But Marie Antoinette's violent personal antagonism towards Lafayette was not common, though several ardent spirits, Danton's for instance, shared it. The mass of those who came across Lafayette felt in connection with him a certain irritation, or a certain contempt, or a certain rather small and distant respect. He inspired no enthusiasms, and when he timidly attempted a rebellion against the new government after the fall of the monarchy, no one would sacrifice himself or follow him. It may be affirmed of Lafayette that if he had not existed, the Revolution would have pursued much the same course as it did, with this exception, that there would not have been formed a definitely middle-class armed guard to provoke friction in Paris. The National Guard would have been more open to all ranks. In religion the man was anodyne, Catholic of course by baptism, but distinctly Protestant in morals and in general tone. In dogma, until the end of his life, free-thinking, of course. Like all his contemporaries, he was personally courageous, but foolishly despised the duel. One anecdote out of many will help to fix his nature in the mind of the reader. Mirabeau, casting about as usual for aid in his indebtedness, sent urgently to him as to a fellow noble, a fellow politician, and a fellow supporter of the crown, begging a loan of £2,000. Lafayette accorded him 1,000. Dumouriez. Dumouriez presents a character particularly difficult for the modern Englishman to comprehend, so remote is his circumstance and fundamentals from those of our time. Of good birth, but born in a generation when social differences had become a jest for intelligent and active men, and he was intelligent and active, courageous, with a good knowledge of his trade of soldiering, of rapid decision and excellent judgment where troops or terrain were concerned. He was all at sea in the comprehension of men, and he bore no loyalty to the state. It is this last feature which will particularly surprise the English reader, for it is the singular and permanent advantage of oligarchic communities, such as the British, that they retain under any stress and show throughout the whole Commonwealth the sense of the state. To betray the state, to act against its interests, to be imperfectly conscious of its existence, are crimes or weaknesses unknown to the citizens of an oligarchy, and a citizen of this country cannot easily conceive of them today. In democracies and despotisms, on the other hand, to forget one's duty to the state, to be almost oblivious of its corporate existence, is a common weakness, There is here a compensation, and by just so much as despotism and democracy permit, rapid, effective, and all-compelling action on the part of the State. By just so much as they permit sudden and sometimes miraculous enthusiasms, which save or which confirm a State. By that also do they lack the quiet and persistent consciousness of the State, which oligarchy fosters and determines. Dumouriez, excellent as a general, can only be appreciated by those who have looked closely into the constitution of the forces which he was to command, and to the adversaries with whom he had to deal. It is the prime quality of a great commander that his mind stands ready for any change in circumstances or in the material to his hand, and even when we have allowed for elements of luck, which is so considerable in military affairs, we must not forget that Dumouriez saved without disaster the wretched and disorganized bands, inchoate and largely mutinous as to their old units, worthless and amateur as to their new, which had to meet in and behind the Argonne, the model army of Prussia. We must not forget that his plan for the invasion of the Low Countries was a just and sensible one, nor with what skill, after the inevitable defeat and retreat of the spring of 1793, he saved his command intact. As a subordinate to an armed executive, to the government of Napoleon, for instance, the man would have been priceless. Nay, had circumstances permitted him to retain supreme command of civil as of military power, he would have made no bad dictator. His mere technical skill was so considerable as to make the large sums paid to him by the English government seem a good bargain, even at our distance of time, and his plans for the defence of England and for the attack of Napoleon are a proof of the value at which he was estimated. But Dumouriez was quite unable to act under the special circumstances in which he happened to be placed at the moment of his treason. A mere ambition had carried him from intrigue to intrigue among the politicians. He despised them as an active and capable soldier was compelled to despise them. He was too old to share any of their enthusiasms, even had his temperament permitted him to entertain any vision, political or religious. He certainly never felt the least moral bond attaching to him to what was in his eyes the chance anarchy of the last 6 months of the French government under which he served. And if he is to be branded with the title of traitor, then we must brand with the same title all that multitude of varied men who escaped from the country in the emigration, who left it in disgust, or even who remained in France but despaired of French fortunes in the turmoil of 1793. It is perhaps a worthy excuse for Dumouriez's failure to point out that he also was one of those whom the court might have used had it known how to use men, but the court had no such knowledge. Danton. The character of Danton has more widely impressed the world than of any other revolutionary leader, because it contained elements permanently human, independent of the democratic theory of the time, and necessary neither to the support of that theory nor to the criticism of it. The character of Danton appeals to that sense in man which is interested in action and which in the field of letters takes the form of drama. His vigor, his personal strength of mind and body, the individuality of his outline, arrest equally the man who loves the revolution and the man who hates it, and the man who is quite indifferent to its success or failure. It is on this very account that historians, especially foreign historians, have tended to misinterpret the man. Thus Carlyle, who has great intuition in the matter, yet makes him out farmer-like, which he certainly was not. Michelet, fascinated by his energy, presents him as something uncouth, and in general, those who would describe Danton stand at a distance, as it were, where his loud voice and forcible gesture may best be appreciated. But a man to be seen truly must be seen in intimacy. Danton was essentially a compound of two powerful characters in man. He was amative or constructive, and at the same time not only possessed, but liked to exercise lucidity of thought. The combination is among the strongest of all those that go to build up human personalities. That which was amative and constructive in him, his virility, if you will, brought him into close touch with reality. He knew and loved his own country, for instance, and infinitely preferred its happy survival to the full development of any political theory. He also knew and loved his fellow countrymen in detail and as persons. He knew what made a Frenchman weak and what made him strong. The vein of Huguenotry, though he did not know it for what it was, he disliked in his compatriots. On the other hand, the salt and freshness of the French was native to him, and he delighted in it. The freedom of their expression, the noise of their rhetoric, and the military subsoil of them were things to all of which he immediately responded. He understood their sort of laughter, nor was he shocked as a man less national would have been at their peculiar national vices, and in especial their lapses into rage. It is this which must account for what all impartial judgment most blames in him, which is his indifference to the cruelties, his absorbed interest in foreign and military affairs at the moment of the massacres of September. This touch with reality made him understand in some fashion, though only from without, the nature of the Germans. The foolish mania of their rulers for mere territorial expansion unaccompanied by persuasion or the spread of their ideas, he comprehended. The vast superiority of their armies over the disorganized forces of the French in 1792 he clearly seized. Hence, on the one hand, his grasp of their foreign policy, and on the other, his able negotiation of the retreat after Valmy. He also understood, however, and more profoundly, the rapid self-organization of which his own countrymen were capable, and it was upon this knowledge that his determination to risk the continuance of the war reposed. It should be remarked that both in his military and in his quasi-military action he was himself endowed in a singular degree with that power of immediate decision which is characteristic of his nation. His lucidity of thought permitted him to foresee the consequences of many a revolutionary decision, and at the same time inclined him to a strong sympathy with the democratic creed, with the doctrine of equality, and especially with the remoulding of the national institutions, particularly his own profession of the law, upon simple lines. He was undoubtedly a sincere and convinced revolutionary, and one whose doctrine more permeated him than did that of many of his contemporaries, their less than solid minds. He was not on that account necessarily Republican. Had some accident called his genius into play earlier in the development of the struggle, he might well, like Mirabeau, with whom he presents so curious a parallel, have thought it better for the country to save the monarchy. It must always be remembered that he was a man of wide culture, and one who had achieved an early and satisfactory professional success. He was earning a sound income at the moment of his youthful marriage. He read English largely and could speak it. His dress was not inexpensive, and though somewhat disordered, as often it is with the men of intense energy and constant gesture, it never gave an impression of carelessness or disarray. He had many and indifferent intellectual interests, and was capable thereof of intelligent application in several fields. He appreciated the rapid growth of physical science, and at the same time the complexity of the old social conditions, too widely different from contemporary truths. To religion he was, of course, like all men of that time, utterly indifferent. But unlike many of them, he seized the precise proportion of its remaining effect upon certain districts and certain sections of the countryside. There has been a tendency latterly to exaggerate the part which Freemasonry played in the launching of him. He was indeed a member of a Masonic lodge, as were for that matter all the men, conspicuous or obscure, democratic or utterly reactionary, who appeared upon the revolutionary stage. Probably the king, certainly old aristocrats like the father of Madame de Lamballe, and the whole host of the middle class, from men like Bailly to men like Condorcet. But it is reading history backwards and imagining the features of our own time to have been present a century ago, to make of Masonry the determining element in his career. Danton failed and died from two combined causes. First, his health gave way. Secondly, he obtruded his sanity and civilian sense into the heated fury and calculated martial law of the second year of the Republic. To both that fury and that calculation he was an obstacle. His opposition to the Terror lost him the support of the enthusiasts. But it was the interference which such a judgment made in the plans of the soldiers, and notably of Carnot, that determined his condemnation and death. He also, like Mirabeau, will undoubtedly increase as the years proceed, and, if only as a representative of the national temper, become more and more the typical figure of the Revolution in action. The end of section 8. Section 9. The French Revolution. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The French Revolution by Hilaire Belloc. Section 9, Chapter 3 continued. Carnot. Carnot, the predecessor of Napoleon and the organizing soldier of the early revolutionary wars, owed his power to backbone. He had not only a good solidity of brain, but an astonishing power of using it for hours and hours on end. This he owed perhaps to the excellent physical stock of which he came, the eldest of a very large family born to a notable lawyer in Burgundy. It was Carnot's pride to hold a commission in the learned arms which were to transform at that moment the art of war. For as Bonaparte, his successor, was a gunner, so he was a sapper. His practice of exact knowledge and application, and the liberal education which his career demanded, further strengthened the strong character he had inherited. More important still, in his democratic views, he was what none of the older officers had been, convinced and sincere. He had not come within the influence of the very wealthy or the very powerful. He was young, and he knew his own mind, not only in matters of political faith, but in the general domain of philosophy and in the particular one of military science. It has been said of him that he invented the revolutionary method of strategical concentration and tactical massing in the field. There is some truth in this, but the method would not have been possible had he not also invented, in company with Danton, and supported after Danton left power, a universal system of conscription. Carnot understood, as only trained soldiers can, the value of numbers, and he depended with great sagacity upon the national temper. Thus at Wattignies, which was a victory directly due to his genius, though it was novel in him to have massed troops suddenly upon the right after a check on the extreme left of the field, yet the novelty would have been of no effect had he not comprehended that, with his young fellow countrymen as troopers, he could depend upon a charge delivered after 36 hours of vigil. He used not only the national but also the revolutionary temper in war. One of the chief features, for instance, of the revolutionary armies when they began to be successful was the development of lines of skirmishers who pushed out heartily before the main bodies and were the first in the history of modern warfare to learn the use of cover. This development was spontaneous. It was produced within and by each unit, not by any general command. But Carnot recognized it at Hoondschoote and used it ever after. The stoical inflexibility of his temper is the noblest among the many noble characters of his soul. He never admitted the empire, and he suffered exile, seemingly thereby, in the eyes of the vilest and most intelligent of his contemporaries, Fouché, to be a mere fool. He was as hard with himself as with others, wholly military in the framework of his mind, and the chief controller of the terror which he used as it was intended to be used for the military salvation of the Republic. Marat. Marat is easily judged. The complete sincerity of the enthusiast is not difficult to appreciate when his enthusiasm is devoted to a simple human ideal which has been, as it were, fundamental and common to the human race. Equality within the State and the government of the State by its general will, these primal dogmas, on the reversion to which the whole revolution turned, were Marat's creed. Those who would ridicule or condemn him because he held such a creed are manifestly incapable of discussing the matter at all. The ridicule and condemnation under which Marat justly falls do not attach to the patent moral truths he held, but to the manner in which he held them. He did not only hold them isolated from other truths — it is the fault of the fanatic to so hold any truth — but he held them as though no other truths existed. And whenever he found his ideal to be in practice working at a friction or stopped dead, his unnourished and acute enthusiasms at once sought a scapegoat, discovered a responsible agent, and suggested a violent outlet for the delay. He was often right when he denounced a political intriguer. He often would have sacrificed a victim not unjustly condemned. He often discovered an agent partially responsible, and even the violent solutions that he suggested were not always impractical. But it was the prime error of his tortured mind that beyond victims and sudden violent clutches at the success of democracy, there was nothing else he could conceive. He was incapable of allowing for imperfections, for stupidities, for the misapprehension of mind by mind, for the mere action of time, and for all that renders human life infinitely complex and infinitely adjustable. Humour, the reflection of such wisdom, he lacked. Judgment, as the English idiom has it, he lacked still more, if a comparative term may be attached to two such absolute vacuities. It must not be forgotten that so complete an absence of certain necessary qualities in the building up of mind are equivalent to madness. Marat was not sane. His insanity was often generous. The creed to which it was attached was obvious enough, and in the eyes of most of us it is a creed to be accepted. But he worked with it as a madman who is mad on collectivism, let us say, or the rights of property might work in our society, thinking of this one thesis, shrieking it and foaming at the mouth upon it, losing all control when its acceptance was not even opposed but merely delayed. He was valueless for the accomplishment of the ends of the Revolution. His doctrine and his adherence to it were so conspicuously simple and sincere that it is no wonder the populace made him, for a few months, a sort of a symbol of their demand. For the rest, his face, like the character, was tortured. He carried with him a disease of the skin that irritated perpetually his wholly unbalanced temper. Some say, but one must always be aware of so-called science in the reading of history, that a mixture of racial types produced in him was a perpetual physical disturbance. His face was certainly distorted and ill-balanced, but physical suggestions of that sort are very untrustworthy. Those who met him in the management of affairs thought him worthless enough. A few who knew him intimately loved him dearly. More who came across him continually were fatigued and irritated by his empty violence. He was among those young revolutionaries, almost an elderly man. He was, this should never be forgotten, a distinguished scholar in his own trade, that of medicine, and he effected less in the Revolution than any man to whom a reputation of equal prominence happened to attach. He must stand responsible for the massacre of September. Robespierre. No character in the Revolution needs for its comprehension a wider reading and a greater knowledge of the national character than Robespierre's. Upon no character does the comprehension of the period more depend, and none, for reasons I will give in a moment, has been more misunderstood, not only in the popular legend, but in the weighed decisions of competent historians. So true is this that even time, which, in company with scholarship, usually redresses such errors, has not yet permitted modern authors to give a true picture of the man. The reason of so conspicuous a failure in the domain of history is this: that side by side with the real Robespierre there existed in the minds of all his contemporaries, save those who actually came across him in the functions of government, a legendary Robespierre, a Robespierre popularly imagined, and that this imaginary Robespierre while it or he has proved odious to posterity, seemed while he lived a fascinating portrait to the man himself, and therefore he accepted it. For Robespierre, though just, lacked humility. The problem is an exceedingly subtle as well as an exceedingly difficult one. The historian, as he reads his authorities, has perpetually to distinguish between what is strong and what is weak evidence, and to recall himself, as he reads, to reality by a recollection of what Robespierre himself was. If he does not do so, he falls at once into the legend. So powerful is that legend in the numbers that supported it, and so strongly did Robespierre himself support it by his own attitude. The legendary Robespierre may be described in a very few lines. Conceive a man sincerely convinced of the purest democratic theory, a man who cared for nothing else but the realization of that theory, and who had never sacrificed his pursuit of its realization in the state to any personal advantage whatsoever. This man, trusted by the people and at last idolized by them, becomes more and more powerful. He enters the governing body, the Committee of Public Safety. He is the master both within and without that body, and uses his mastery for establishing an ideal democracy which shall recognize the existence of God and repose upon civic virtue. And to establish this ideal he has recourse to terror. He finds that human defections from his ideal are increasingly numerous. He punishes them by death. The slaughter grows to be enormous. The best of democrats are involved in it. At last it can be tolerated no longer. His immediate subordinates revolt against him in the committee. He is outlawed, fails to raise a popular rebellion in his favor in Paris, is executed, and his system of terror falls to the ground. This picture, though purely legendary in tone, contains not only much truth, but truth of precisely that sort which conspires to make credible what is false in the whole. Robespierre was sincerely attached to the conception of an ideal democracy. He was incorruptible in the pursuit of it. And to be a politician and incorruptible amounts to something like what the Church calls heroic virtue in a man. He did enter the Committee of Public Safety. He did support the terror, and when he was overthrown, the terror did come to an end. Where then does this legend differ from the truth? In these capital points, which change it altogether: that Robespierre was not the chief influence in the Committee of Public Safety, the all-powerful executive of the Republic, that he did not desire the terror, that he did not use it, that he even grew disgusted with it, and that in general he was never the man who governed France. It need hardly be pointed out how such a truth destroys a legend. The whole nature of the 12 months between the summer of 1793 and the summer of 1794 must vary accordingly as we regard them as Robespierrean or no, and they were not Robespierrean. What were they then, and why has the error that Robespierre was then master arisen? Those months, which may roughly be called the months of the terror, were, as we shall see later in this book, months of martial law, and the terror was simply martial law in action, a method of enforcing the military defense of the country and of punishing all those who interfered with it or were supposed by the committee to interfere with it. No one man in the committee was the author of this system, but the one who most determined to use it, and the one who had most occasion to use it, was undoubtedly the military organizer, Carnot. Side by side with him, one man, such as Berryer, supported it because it kept up the Committee of Public Safety, which gave him all his political position. Another, such as Saint Just, supported it because he believed that the winning of the war, in which he took an active part, would secure democracy everywhere and forever. Another, such as Jean Bon, supported it from the old sectarian bitterness of the Huguenot. But of all men in the committee, Robespierre supported the terror least, and was most suspected by his colleagues, and increasingly suspected as time went on, of desiring to interfere with the martial system of the terror and to modify it. Why then was Robespierre popularly identified with the terror, and why, when he was executed, did the terror cease. Robespierre was identified with the terror because he was identified with the popular clamour of the time, with the extreme democratic feeling of the time, and its extreme fear of a reaction. Robespierre, being the popular idol, had become also the symbol of a popular frenzy, which was supposed to be ruling the country. But that frenzy was not ruling the country. What was ruling the country was the Committee of Public Safety, in which Carnot was the chief brain. Robespierre was indeed the idol of the populace. He was in no way the agent of their power or of any power. Why, when he fell, did the terror cease if he were not its author? Because the terror was acting under a strain. It was with the utmost difficulty that this absolute, intolerant, and intolerable martial system could be continued when once the fear of invasion was removed. For some weeks before Robespierre fell, the victories had begun to render it unnecessary. When the committee saw to it that Robespierre should be outlawed by the Parliament, they knocked away, without knowing it, the keystone of their own policy. It was his popular position which made their policy possible. When he was destroyed, they suddenly found that the terror could no longer be maintained. Men had borne with it because of Robespierre, falsely imagining that Robespierre had desired it. Robespierre gone, men now would not bear with it any more. Now finally, if Robespierre himself had always felt opposed to the system of the terror, why did he not take the lead in popular reaction against it? He had his opportunity, given him by Danton in December 1793, 7 months before his own catastrophe. The committee determined to put Danton out of the way because Danton, in appealing for mercy, was weakening the martial power of their government. Robespierre might have saved Danton. He preferred to let him be sacrificed. The reason was that Robespierre wrongly believed popularity to lie upon the side of the terror and against Danton. He was in no way a leader, save in rhetoric, and in rhetoric directed towards what men already desired. And his own great weakness or vice was the love of popular acclaim. Later on, in the summer of 1794, when he actually began to move against the terror, he only did so privately. He so misread men that he still believed the terror to be popular, and dared not lose his popular name. A man by nature as sincere as crystal, he was tempted to insincerity in this major thing during the last months of his life, and he yielded completely to the temptation. For the sake of his memory, it was deplorable, and deplorable also for history. His weakness has been the cause of an historical error as grave as any that can be discovered in modern letters, and at the same time has wholly maligned him to posterity. A factor in Robespierre's great public position, which is often forgotten, is the great effect of his speeches. That men should still debate after so vast a change in taste whether those speeches were eloquent or no, is a sufficient proof of their effect. He spoke in an ordered and reasoned manner which bored the fine spirits of the early parliaments, but well suited the violent convictions of the later revolution. His phraseology, his point of view, just jumped with that of his audience. He could express what they felt, and express it in terms which they knew to be exact, and which they believed to be grand. For his manner was never excessive, and those excessive men who heard him in an excessive mood were proud to know that their violence could be expressed with so much scholarship and by moderated skill. By birth he was of the smaller gentry, though poor. It is an indication of his character that he had thought of taking orders, and that in early youth literary vanity had affected him. He has left no monument, but from the intensity of his faith and from his practice of it, his name, though it will hardly increase, will certainly endure. The end of section 9. The end of chapter 3. Section 10. The French Revolution. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The French Revolution by Hilaire Belloc. Section 10, Chapter 4, The Phases of the Revolution. 1. From May 1789 to 17th of July 1789. The first point which the reader must hold in the story of the Revolution is the quarrel between its first Parliament and the Crown. Of what nature was that quarrel? It was not, as it has sometimes been represented, a simple issue between privilege and a democratic demand for equality, or between traditional organs of government and a democratic demand for self-government by the nation. To imagine this is to read history backwards, and to see in the untried conditions of 1789 the matured results which only appeared after years of struggle. The prime issue lay between legality and illegality. The forms of French law and all the inherited method of French administration demanded a certain form of authority, a centralized government of unlimited power. The king was absolute. From him proceeded in the simplest fashion whatever will was paramount in the state. He could suspend a debtor's liabilities, imprison a man without trial, release him without revision of his case, make war or peace, and in minor details, such as the discipline and administration of public bodies, the power of the Crown was theoretically and legally equally supreme. It was not exercised as the enormous power of modern government is exercised. It did not perpetually enter into every detail of the life of the poor in the way in which the power of a modern English government enters into it. It is the very nature of such autocratic power that, while unlimited in theory, it is compelled to an instinctive and perpetual self-limitation, lest it break down, and autocracy may be compared in this to aristocracy, or more properly speaking to oligarchy, the government of a few. For where a few govern, they know that their government reposes upon public opinion or public tolerance. They are very careful not to exceed certain limits, the transgression of which would weaken the moral foundation of their power. They welcome allies, they recruit themselves perpetually from other classes in the community. In the same way, an autocracy always has the desire to be popular. Its strokes affect the great and the powerful, and are hardly ever aimed at the mass of the community. The intellectual, the wealthy, the privileged by birth, fortune, or exceptional personal powers are suspect to it. As for the mass of men, an autocracy attempts to represent and, in a certain sense, to obey them. Now the French autocracy, for it was no less, erred not in the will to act thus popularly in the early part of the Revolution, but in the knowledge requisite for such action. The Parliament, shortly after it met in May of 1789, began to show in the Commons part of it the working of that great theory which had leavened all France for a generation. The Commons said, "We are the people, at once the symbols of the people, the direct mandatory servants of the people, and, though this was a fiction, we are of the people in our birth and origin. We are therefore the true sovereign, and the Prince, the head of the executive, is no more than an organ of government, morally less in authority than ourselves, who are the true source of government." This attitude, which was at the back of all men's minds, and which was concentrated, of course, in the Commons, clashed with legality. It could not express itself in the terms of law. It could not act save in a fashion which should be, in the strictest sense of the word, revolutionary. Now the Crown, on the whole national in sympathy, and comprehending this new theory well, I mean by the Crown the general body of advisers around the King and the King himself, was offended at the illegality, not of the theory or of the pretense, for these were not illegal, but of the action of the Commons. And this comparatively small source of friction was the irritant upon which we must fix as the cause of what followed. The nobles, by 108 to 47, decided the day after the opening of the Parliament to sit as a separate house. The clergy, by a much smaller majority, 133 to 114, came to the same decision, but carefully qualified it as provisional. The Commons declared that the hall in which they met should be regarded as the hall of the National Assembly, and later made it their business, to quote the phrase of the motion, to attempt to unite in common all the deputies of the nation in that hall, and never to abandon the principle of voting individually, that is, not by separate houses, or the principle that the States General formed one undivided body. This attitude was qualified and compromised with to some extent in the days which followed, but it held the field, and while the Commons were insisting upon this attitude as a moral right, the nobles countered by a reaffirmation of the right of each house to a separate judgment upon public matters. The nobles were standing upon legal precedent. The Commons had nothing in their favour but political theory. If the orders sat all together and voted as individuals, the Commons, who were in number equal to the other two houses combined, would, with their noble and clerical sympathizers, have a majority. Now the King and his advisers, notably Necker, who still had great weight, were by no means impossibilists in this struggle. They desired an understanding, and through the last days of May and the first days of June, the attempt at an understanding was made. But the attempt dragged, and as it seemed that nothing would come out of it, on the 10th of June, Size moved that the Assembly should verify its powers, a French phrase for admitting and registering the presence of each member as acceptable to the whole body and to the theory of its constitution, and that this should be done in the case of each member, meaning members of all the three orders and not the Common alone, whether the members of the two privileged houses were present or absent. The roll was called and completed on the 15th. None of the nobles attended the common roll call. 3 of the parish clergy, they were from the province of Poitou, did so, and thus admitted the right of the Commons so to act. A dozen of their colleagues joined them later, but that was all. So far there had been no action which could be precisely called illegal or revolutionary. The Commons had affirmed a right based upon a political theory which the vast majority of the nation admitted, and the legal depository of power, the King, had not yet reproved. One may draw a parallel and compare the action of the Commons so far to some action which trade union, for instance, may take in England, some action the legality of which is doubtful, but upon which the courts have not yet decided. It was upon the 17th of June, 2 days after the completion of the roll call by the Commons, that the first revolutionary act took place, and the student of the Revolution will do well to put his finger upon that date, and to regard it not indeed as the moral origin of the movement, but as the precise moment from which the Revolution, as a revolution, begins to act. For upon that day the Commons, though in fact only joined by a handful of the clerical house and by none of the nobility, declared themselves to be the National Assembly. That is, asserted the fiction that the clergy, nobles and Commons were all present and voted together. To this declaration they added a definite act of sovereignty which trespassed upon and contradicted the legal authority of the Crown. True, the motion was only moved and passed provisionally, but the words used were final, for in this motion the self-styled National Assembly declared that provisionally taxes and dues might be raised upon the old authority, but that only until the National Assembly should disperse. After which day, and here we reach the sacramental formula, as it were, of the crisis, the National Assembly wills and decrees that all taxes and dues of whatever nature which have not been specifically, formally and freely granted by the said Assembly shall cease in every province of the kingdom, no matter how such that province may be administered. This is an allusion to the fact that in some provinces there was representative machinery, in others nothing but the direct action of the Crown. The Assembly declares that when it has, in concert with, not in obedience to, the King, laid down the principle of a national resettlement, It will busy itself with the examination and ordering of the public debt, etc., etc. Such was the point of departure after which sovereignty was at issue between the Crown and the States General. The Crown, a known institution with its traditions stretching back to the Roman Empire, and the National Assembly, a wholly new organ according to its own claims, basing its authority upon a political theory stretching back to the very origins of human society. The end of section 10. Section 11. The French Revolution. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The French Revolution by Hilaire Belloc. Section 11, Chapter 4, continued. 2 days later, on the 19th of June, the National Assembly, still only self-styled and possessing only the powers which it had ascribed to itself beyond all forms of law, set to work, nominated its committees, and assumed the sovereignty thus claimed. The nobles protested, notably the bishops, and the king, on the advice of Barrington, keeper of the seals, determined upon immediate resistance. The excuse was taken that the royal session, as it was called, in which the king would declare his will, needed the preparation of the hall, and when the Commons presented themselves at the door of that hall on the next day, the 20th, they found it shut against them. They adjourned to a neighbouring tennis court, and took a solemn corporate oath that they would not separate without giving France a constitution. They continued to meet, using a church for that purpose. But on the 23rd, the royal session was opened, and the king declared his will. The reader must especially note that even in this crisis the Crown did not offer a complete resistance. There was an attempt at compromise. Necker would have had a more or less complete surrender. The Queen and her set would have preferred an act of authority which should have annulled all that the Commons had done. What actually happened was a permission by the Crown that the three orders should meet as one body for certain common interests, but should preserve the system of voting as separate houses in all that might regard the ancient and constitutional rights of the three orders, the constitution to be given to future parliaments, feudal property, and the rights and prerogatives of the two senior houses. As a mere numerical test, such a conclusion would have destroyed the power of the Commons, since, as we have seen, numbers were the weapon of the Commons, who were equal to the other two houses combined, and if all sat together, would, with the liberal members of the clergy and the nobility, be supreme. But apart from this numerical test, the act of sovereignty affirmed by the National Assembly when it declared itself, and itself only, competent to vote taxes, was annulled. Moreover, the royal declaration ended with a command that on the next day the three orders should meet separately. Now at this critical point the king was disobeyed. The current of the time chose the revolutionary bed, and as it began to flow deepened and confirmed its course with every passing day and event. Already the majority of the clergy had joined the National Assembly when it had affirmed its right to sit in spite of the check of the 20th of June. There was a half hour on that decisive day of the royal session, the 23rd of June, when armed forces might have been used for the arrest and dispersion of the deputies. They declared themselves inviolable and their arrest illegal, but there was of course no sanction for this decree. As a fact, not a corporal's file was used against them. The next day, the 24th, the majority of the clergy again joined the Commons in their session, in flat defiance of the king's orders, and on the 25th 47 of the nobles followed their example. The king yielded, and on the 27th, 2 days later, ordered the three houses to meet together. The National Assembly was now legally constituted and set out upon its career. The Crown, the old centre of authority, had abandoned its position and had confirmed the revolution. But in doing so it had acted, as it were, in contradiction with itself. It had made technically legal an illegality which destroyed its own old legal position, but it had done so with ill will, and it was evident that some counter stroke would be attempted to restore the full powers of the Crown. At this point the reader must appreciate what forces were face to face in the coming struggle. So far, the illegal and revolutionary act of the 17th of June, the royal session which replied to that act upon the 23rd, the King's decree which yielded to the Commons upon the 27th, had all of them been but words. If it came to action, what physical forces were opposed? On the side of the Crown was the organized armed force which it commanded. For it must never be forgotten that the Crown was the executive, and remained the executive right on to the capture of the palace 3 years later, and the consummation of the Revolution on the 10th of August in 1792. On the side of the National Assembly was, without doubt, the public opinion of the country. But that is not a force that can be used under arms. And what was much more to the point, the municipal organization of France. Space forbids a full description of the origins and strength of the French municipal system. It is enough to point out that the whole of Gallic civilization, probably from a moment earlier than Caesar's invasion, and certainly from the moment when Roman rule was paramount in Gaul, was a municipal one. It is still so. The countrysides take their names mainly from the chief towns. The towns were the seats of the bishops, whose hierarchy had preserved whatever could be preserved of the ancient world. In the towns were the colleges, the guilds, the discussion, and the corporations which built up the life of the nation. The chief of these towns was Paris. The old systems of municipal government, corrupt and varied as they were, could still give the towns a power of corporate expression. And even where that might be lacking, it was certain that some engine would be found for expressing municipal action in a crisis of the sort through which France was now passing. In Paris, for instance, it was seen, when the time came for physical force, that the college of electors who had chosen the representatives for that city were willing to act at once and spontaneously as a municipal body which should express the initiative of the people. It was the towns, and especially Paris, prompt at spontaneous organization, ready to arm, and when armed competent to frame a fighting force, which was the physical power behind the assembly. What of the physical power behind the king? His power was, as we have said, the regular armed forces of the country, the army. But it is characteristic of the moment that only a part of that armed force could be trusted. For an army is never a mere weapon. It consists of living men, and though it will act against the general opinion of its members, and will obey orders long after civilians would have broken with the ties of technical and legal authority, yet there is for armies also a breaking point in those ties, and the Crown, I repeat, could not use as a whole the French-speaking and French-born soldiery. Luckily for it, a very great proportion of the French army at that moment consisted of foreign mercenaries. Since the position was virtually one of war, we must consider what was the strategical object of this force. Its object was Paris, the chief of the towns, and round Paris in the early days of July the mercenary regiments were gathered from all quarters. That military concentration once effected, the gates of the city held, especially upon the north and upon the west, by encamped regiments and by a particularly large force of cavalry, ever the arm chosen for the repression of civilians, the Crown was ready to act. On the 11th of July, Necker, who stood for liberal opinions, was dismissed. A new ministry was formed and the counter-revolution begun. What followed was the immediate rising of Paris. The news of Necker's dismissal reached the masses of the capital only an hour's ride from Versailles on the afternoon of the 12th, Sunday. Crowds began to gather. An ineffectual cavalry charge in one of the outer open spaces of the city only inflamed the popular enthusiasm, for the soldiers who charged were German mercenary soldiers under the command of a noble. Public forces were at once organized. Arms were commandeered from the armourers' shops. The Electoral College, which had chosen the members of the Assembly for Paris, took command at the Guildhall. But the capital point of the insurrection, what made it possible, was the seizure of a great stock of arms and ammunition, including cannon. It was in the depot at Invalides. With such resources, the crowd attacked at the other end of the city a fortress and an arsenal, which had long stood in the popular eye as the symbol of absolute monarchy, the Bastille. With the absurdly insufficient garrison of the Bastille, its apparent impregnability to anything the mob might attempt, the supposed but doubtful treason of its governor in firing upon those whom he admitted to parley, we are not here concerned. The Bastille was rushed after very considerable efforts and an appreciable loss in killed and wounded. By the evening of that day, Tuesday, the 14th of July, 1789, Paris had become a formidable instrument of war. The next news was the complete capitulation of the King. He came on the morrow to the National Assembly, promising to send away the troops. He promised to recall Necker. A municipal organization was granted to the city, with Bailly for its first mayor, and a point of capital importance, an armed militia dependent upon that municipality was legally formed, with Lafayette at its head. On the 17th, Louis entered Paris to consummate his capitulation, went to the Guildhall, appeared in the tricoloured cockade, and the popular battle was won. It behooves us here to consider the military aspect of this definitive act from which the sanction of the Revolution, the physical power behind it, dates. Paris numbered somewhat under 1,000,000 souls, perhaps no more than 600,000. The number fluctuated with the season. The foreign mercenary troops, who were mainly employed in the repression of the popular feeling therein, were not sufficient to impose anything like a siege. They could at the various gates have stopped the provisioning of the city, but then at any one of those separate points, any one of their detachments upon a long perimeter more than a day's march in circumference would certainly have been attacked and almost as certainly overwhelmed by masses of partially armed civilians. Could the streets have been cleared while the ferment was rising? It is very doubtful. They were narrow and tortuous in the extreme. The area to be dealt with was enormous. The tradition of barricades not forgotten, and the spontaneous action of that excellent fighting material which a Paris mob contains, had been quite as rapid as anything that could have been effected by military orders. The one great fault was a neglect to cover the Invalides. But even had the Invalides not been looted, the stock of arms and powder in the city would have been sufficient to have organized a desperate and prolonged resistance. The local auxiliary force, of slight military value it is true, the French Guards as they were called, were wholly with the people, and in general the Crown must be acquitted of any considerable blunder on the military side of this struggle. It certainly did not fail from lack of will. The truth is, if we consider merely the military aspect of this military event, that in dealing with large bodies of men who are a. not previously disarmed, b. under conditions where they cannot be dispersed, and c. capable by a national tradition or character of some sort of rapid spontaneous organization, the issue will always be doubtful, and the uncertain factor, which is the tenacity, decision, and common will of the civilians to which soldiers are to be opposed, is one that varies within the very widest limits. In massing the troops originally, the Crown and its advisers estimated that uncertain factor at far too low a point. Even contemporary educated opinion, which was in sympathy with Paris, put it too low. That factor was as a fact so high that no armed force of the size and quality which the Crown then disposed of could achieve its object or hold down the capital. As for the absurd conception that any body of men in uniform, however small, could always have the better of civilian resistance, however large and well organized, it is not worthy of a moment's consideration by those who interest themselves in the realities of military history. It is worthy only of the academies. So ends the first phase of the Revolution. It had lasted from the opening of the States General in May to the middle of July in 1789. The end of section 11. Section 12. The French Revolution. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The French Revolution by Hilaire Belloc. Section 12, Chapter 4 continued, the second phase, from the 17th of July, 1789, to the 6th of October, 1789. We've seen the military conditions under which the attempt at an armed counter-revolution failed. There follows a short phase of less than 3 months whose character can be quickly described. It was that moment of the revolution in which ideas had the freest play, in which least had been done to test their application, and most scope remained for pure enthusiasm. That is why we find in the midst of that short phase the spontaneous abandonment of the feudal rights of the nobility, and that is why the violent uprisings all over France continued. It is the period in which the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, a document which may fittingly stand side by side with the Declaration of Independence, for together they form the noblest monuments of our modern origins, was promulgated. In the same period were the elements of the future Constitution rapidly debated and laid down, and notably that national policy of a single chamber, which the modern French have imprudently abandoned. In that same period, however, appeared, and towards the close of it, another form of resistance on the part of the Crown, and of those who advised the Crown. The King hesitated to accept the Declaration of the Rights of Man, and similarly hesitated to promulgate the decree of the 4th of August, in which the nobility had abandoned their feudal dues. It would be foolish to exaggerate the military aspect of what followed. Louis did call in troops, but only in numbers sufficient for personal defence, and we can hardly believe that he intended anything more than to police the surroundings of his throne. But the brigade, for it was no more, nor was it of full strength, which he summoned, was sufficient to kindle suspicion, and the determinedly false position of the Queen, who all her life was haunted by the idea that the regular soldiers, especially if they were well dressed and held themselves rigidly, were a sort of talisman, provoked an explosion. A feast was given in which the officers of the regiment of Flanders, which had just reached Versailles, were entertained by the officers of the Guard. It was made the occasion for a good deal of drunkenness and a violent royalist manifestation, at which the Queen was present, though she approved, and which some thought she had designed. The failure of the harvest to relieve the scarcity of bread in Paris, the permanent state of alarm in which Paris had remained, and of suspicion for the safety of the Parliament which it continually entertained since the early part of the summer, needed no more to provoke an outbreak. It is an error to imagine that the outbreak was engineered, or that such a movement could have been facetious. Great masses of women, in whom the movement originated, and after them a whole flood of the populace, marched upon Versailles. There was no direct attack upon the palace, though the palace feared such an attack at any moment. The troops present were sufficient to prevent violence. Lafayette followed in the night at the head of his new Parisian militia force. Too much reliance was placed upon the military character of this force. The palace was invaded in the early morning. An attempt to assassinate the Queen on the part of the mob failed, though 2 of the guards were killed. And after scenes whose violence and apparent anarchy only masked the common determination of the populace, the royal family were compelled to abandon Versailles and to take up their places in the Tuileries. The Parliament followed them to Paris, and neither King nor Parliament returned again to this suburban palace. This recapture of the King by Paris is much more significant than a mere impulse of the mob. The King in Paris, the unison of his person with the capital city, had been the very sacrament of French life for century upon century. It was precisely 100 years since Paris had been abandoned by Louis XIV for Versailles. The significance of that era may be understood by the citizens of an aristocratic country if they will imagine the abandonment of their countrysides by the squires, or again the future historian of our modern industrial civilization may understand it when he describes how the wealthy manufacturers abandoned the cities in which their wealth was made, to dwell outside and apart from the living interests of their people. With the return of the royal family to Paris, and with the presence of the Assembly within the heart of the national life, one prime factor appears, which is this: that while the National Assembly proceeds step by step to what it imagines to be a complete attainment of democracy, though how partial will soon be seen, the resistance of the Crown is transformed into a resistance of the mere court. The attack on the Revolution becomes a personal thing. The King is still wholly the chief of the executive. He can give what commands he wills to the armed forces. He controls receipts and payments. He is for all active purposes the government. But he is no longer considering that prime function of his, nor even using it to restore his old power. He acts henceforward as an individual, and an individual in danger. The Queen, whose view of the Revolution and its dangers had always been a purely personal one, is the directing will in the court group from this moment, October 1789, onwards, and the chief preoccupation of that group for 18 months is personal safety. Surrounded by the pomp of the Tuileries, and amid all the external appearances of a power still greater than that of any other monarch in Europe, Louis and his wife and their very few immediate and devoted friends and followers thought of the palace as a prison, and never considered their position save as one intolerable. The end of section 12. The end of phase 2. Section 13. The French Revolution. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The French Revolution by Hilaire Belloc. Section 13, Chapter 4, continued. The Phases of the Revolution, Phase 3. From October 1789 to June 1791. It is this which must explain all that followed in the succeeding phase, which lasted from these early days of October 1789 to the last week of June 1791. Throughout that period of 21 months, the King is letting the Revolution take its course with the fixed idea of thwarting it at the last by flying from it, and perhaps conquering it by foreign aid. But even this policy is not consecutively followed. The increasing repugnance of the court and of the King himself to the revolutionary development forbids a consecutive and purely hypocritical acceptation of the National Assembly's decrees. Deliberate and calculated intrigue might yet have saved the monarchy and the persons of the royal family. Oddly enough, an ally in the struggle, an excellent intriguer, a saviour of the monarchical institutions, and a true defender of the royal persons was at hand. It was the hand in the person of Mirabeau. The man had more and more dominated the Assembly. He had been conspicuous from the very first opening days. He had been its very voice in the resistance to the King at Versailles. It was he who had replied to the Master of Ceremonies on June 23rd that the Commons would not disperse. It was he who had moved that persons of the Commons were privileged against arrest. He was of a family noble in station and conspicuous before the people by the wealth and eccentricities of its head, Mirabeau's father. He himself was not unknown even before the Revolution broke out for his violence, his amours, his intelligence, and his debts. He was a few years older than the King and the Queen. His personality repelled them. None the less, his desire to serve them was sincere, and it was his plan, while retaining the great hold over the National Assembly which his rhetoric and his use of men furnished to him, to give to the court, and in particular to the Queen, whom he very greatly and almost reverently admired, such secret advice as might save them. This advice, as we shall see in a moment, tended more and more to be advice for civil war. But Mirabeau's death at the close of the phase we are now entering, on April 2, 1791, and the increasing fears of the King and Queen between them, prevented any statesmanship at all. They prevented even the statesmanship of intrigue, and the period became, on the side of the Revolution, a rapid and uncontrolled development of its democratic theory, limited by the hesitation of the middle class, and on the side of the court an increasing demand for mere physical security and flight, coupled with an increasing determination to return and to restore, as a popular monarchy, the scheme of the past. The 18 months that intervened between the fixing of the Assembly and the royal family in Paris and the death of Mirabeau are remarkable for the following points, which must all be considered abreast, as it were, if we are to understand their combined effects. 1. This was the period in which the constructive work of the National Assembly was done, and in which the whole face of the nation was changed. The advising bodies of lawyers, called parliaments, were abolished 11 months after the King had come to Paris. The modern departments were organized in the place of the old provinces. The old national and provincial militia was destroyed, but, as it is very important to remember, the old regular army was left untouched. A new judicature and new rules of procedure were established. A new code sketched out in the place of common law model. In a word, it was the period during which most of those things which we regard as characteristic of the revolutionary work were either brought to their theoretic conclusion or given at least their main lines. 2. Among these constructive acts, but so important that it must be regarded separately, was the civil constitution of the clergy, which will be dealt with at length further in this book. It was the principal work and the principal error of that year and a half. 3. The general spirit of the Revolution, more difficult to define than its theory, but easy to appreciate as one follows the development of the movement, increased regularly and enormously in intensity during the period. The power of the King, who was still at the head of the executive, added more and more as an irritant against public opinion, and 4. That public opinion began to express itself in a centralized and national fashion, of which the great federation of the 14th of July 1790 in Paris, on the anniversary of the fall of the Bastille, was the nucleus and also the symbol. The federation consisted in delegates from the National Guard throughout the country, and it was of this capital importance that it introduced into the revolutionary movement a feature of soldiery which made even the regular troops, for the most part, sympathetic with the enthusiasm of the time. 5. These 18 months were again filled with the movement of the emigration. That movement was, of course, the departure of many of the more prominent of the privileged orders, and of a crowd of humbler nobles, as also of a few ecclesiastics from France. The King's brothers, one fled at the beginning of the emigration, the younger; the Comte d'Artois, the other; the elder at its close, and coincidentally with the flight of the King, must especially be noted in this connection. They formed, in company with the more notable of the other emigrants, a regular political body which intrigued continually beyond the frontiers in Germany and Italy against the Revolution. And 6. It was therefore during these months that the ultimate origins of the larger European war must be found. The armed body of the emigrants under Conde formed an organized corps upon the Rhine, and though there was not yet the semblance of an armed movement in Europe beside theirs against the French, yet by the émigrés, as they were called, were sown the seeds of the harvest of which was to be the War of 1792. I have said that during these months, in which most of the constructive work of the Revolution was done, in which the seeds of the Great War were sown, and in which the absolute position of the Crown as the head of the executive was increasingly irritating to the public opinion of the French, and especially of the capital, Mirabeau was the one man who might have preserved the continuity of national institutions by the preservation of the monarchy. He received money from the court, and in return gave it advice. The advice was the advice of genius, but it was listened to less and less in proportion as it was more and more practical. Mirabeau also favoured the abandonment of Paris by the king, but he would have had the king leave Paris openly and with an armed force, withdraw to a neighbouring and loyal centre such as Compiègne, and thence depend upon the fortunes of civil war. Meanwhile, the Queen was determined upon a very different and much more personal plan, into which no conception of statesmanship entered. She was determined to save the persons of her children, herself, and her husband. Plans of flight were made, postponed and repostponed. It was already agreed at the court that not Mirabeau's plan should be followed, but this plan of mere evasion. The army which Bouillé commanded upon the frontier was to send small detachments along the great road from Paris to the east. The first of these were to meet the royal fugitives a little beyond Chalons, and to escort their carriage eastward. Each armed detachment in the chain, as the flight proceeded, was to fall in for its defence, until once the town of Varennes was reached, the king and queen should be in touch with the main body of the army. What was then intended to follow remains obscure. It is fairly certain that the king did not intend to pass the frontier, but to take refuge at Montmedy. The conflict that would have inevitably broken out could hardly have been confined to a civil war. Foreign armies and the German mercenaries in the French service were presumably to be organized, in case the flight succeeded, for a march upon Paris and the complete restoration of the old state of affairs. Had Mirabeau lived, this rash and unstatesmanlike plan might yet have been avoided. It so happened that he died upon April 2nd of 1791, and soon after we enter the third phase of the Revolution, which is that leading directly to the Great War and to the fall of the monarchy. Shortly after Mirabeau's death, a tumult which excessively frightened the royal family prevented the king and queen from leaving the palace and passing Easter at St. Cloud in the suburbs. Though further postponements of their flight followed, the evasion actually took place in the night of the 20th to 21st of June. It very nearly succeeded, but by a series of small accidents, the last of which, the famous ride of Drouet to intercept the fugitives, is among the best known episodes in history. The king and queen and their children were discovered and arrested at Varennes within a few hundred yards of safety, and were brought back to Paris surrounded by enormous and hostile crowds. With the failure of this attempt at flight in the end of June 1791 ends the third phase of the Revolution. The end of section 13. The end of phase 3. Section 14. The French Revolution. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The French Revolution by Hilaire Belloc. Section 14, Chapter 4 continued, Phase 4, from June 1791 to September 1792. To understand the capital effect both of this flight and of its failure, we must once more insist upon the supreme position of the monarchy in the traditions and instinct of French polity. The unwisdom of the flight it would be difficult to exaggerate. It is impossible to exaggerate the moral revolution caused by its failure. It was regarded as virtually an abdication. The strong body of provincial, silent and moderate opinion which still centred on the king and regarded it as his function to lead and to govern was bewildered, and in the main divorced in the future from the crown. It is an excellent proof of what the monarchy had for so long been to France, that even in such a crisis barely the name of a republic was mentioned, and that only in the intellectual circles in Paris. All the constitutional and standing forces of society conspired to preserve the monarchy at the expense of no matter what fictions. The middle class militia guard under Lafayette repressed in what is known as the massacre of the Champ de Mars the beginnings of a popular movement. The more radical leaders, among whom was Danton, fled abroad or hid. The Duke of Orleans utterly failed to take advantage of the moment or to get himself proclaimed regent. The monarchical tradition was too strong. Immediately after the second anniversary of the taking of the Bastille in July, the decrees of the Parliament created the fiction that the king was not responsible for the flight, that he had been carried off. And in the following September, though until then suspended from executive power, the king, on taking the oath to the Constitution, was once more at the head of all the forces of the nation. But all this patching and reparation of the facade of constitutional monarchy, a fiction whose tawdriness is more offensive to the French temper than its falsehood, had come too late. Already the Queen had written to her brother the Emperor of Austria, suggesting the mobilization of a considerable force and its encampment on the frontier to overawe the revolutionary movement. Her action coincided within a few days with the end of that great Parliament which had been chosen on the most democratic suffrage, and which had transformed the whole of society and laid the basis of the revolutionary constitution. With the meeting of the National Assembly's successor on the 1st of October 1791, war was already possible. That possibility was to be transformed very soon into probability, and at last into actuality. In the new Parliament, the weight not of numbers but of leadership fell to a group of enthusiastic and eloquent men, who, from the fact that certain of their principal members came from the Gironde, were called the Girondins. They represented the purest and the most enthusiastic ideal of the democracy, less national perhaps than that advocated by men more extreme than they, but of a sort which, from that time to this, has been able to arouse the enthusiasm of historians. Vergniaud and Isnard were their great orators. Brissot was their intellectual intriguer, and the wife of Roland, one of their members, was, as it were, the soul of the whole group. It was the fact that these men desired war which made war certain, once the temper of this new Second Assembly should be felt. The extremists over against them, to whom I have alluded, known as the Mountain, were especially Parisian in character. Robespierre, who had been at first an obscure and later a sectarian orator of the National Assembly, though not sitting in the Second Parliament, was perhaps the most prominent figure in that group, for he was the public orator of Paris, and indeed the Mountain was Paris. Paris, whether inside or outside the Parliament, Paris acting as the responsible brain of France. Later it was the Mountain that had first opposed the war, which was to ensure the success of the French arms by a rigidity and despotism in action such as the purer and less practical minds of the Girondins abhorred. On the 3rd of September 1791, to quote a fundamental date in the rapid progress towards a war which was to transform the Revolution, the King, writing in a manner which betrays dictation by his wife, begged the King of Prussia, as she had begged the Emperor, to mobilize an armed force, and with it to back a Congress that should have for its object the prevention of the spread of the Revolution. That letter was typical of the moment. From both sides tension was rapidly proceeding to the breaking point. Nor was the tension merely upon generalities. The Revolution had broken a European treaty in the annexation of the Papal State of Avignon, and it had broken European conventions when it had abolished in Alsace feudal rights that were possessed by the princes of the Empire. It was as though some state today, attempting collectivism, should confiscate, along with other property, securities lying in its banks, but held by the nationals of a foreign state. On the revolutionary side also there was a definite point at issue, which was the permission accorded within the Empire for the emigrants to meet in arms and to threaten the French frontier. But these precise and legal points were not the true causes of the war. The true causes of the war were the desire of the unreformed European governments, notably those of Prussia and Austria, that the Revolution should, in their own interests, be checked, and the conviction that their armed forces were easily capable of effecting the destruction of the new French regime. The Court of Vienna refused to accept the just indemnity that was offered the princes of the Empire in Alsace for the loss of their old feudal rights. Leopold, the Emperor, who was one of the same generation as the French King and Queen, died upon the 1st of March, 1792, and was succeeded by a son only 24 years of age and easily persuaded to war. On the French side, with the exception of the Mountain and notably of Robespierre, there was a curious coalition of opinion demanding war. The court and the reactionaries were sufficiently certain of victory of the Allies to find their salvation in war. The revolutionary party, that is, the mass of public opinion, and the patriots, as they called themselves, the Girondins also and especially, desired war as a sort of crusade for the Revolution. They suffered grievous illusions, its enthusiasts always must, and believed the French armed forces capable of sustaining the shock. The plans had already been drawn up for the campaign and promptly betrayed to the enemy by the Queen. Dumouriez, an excellent soldier, had from the middle of March 1792 been the chief person in the ministry and the director of foreign affairs, and a month later, on the 20th of April, war was declared against Austria, or to be accurate, against the King of Hungary and Bohemia. Such was still the official title of Marie Antoinette's nephew, who, though now succeeded to the empire, had not yet been crowned emperor. It was hoped to confine the war to this monarch, and indeed the German princes of the empire did not join him. The Landgrave of Hesse-Kassel was an exception. But the one German power that counted most, the Kingdom of Prussia, which Dumouriez had especially hoped to keep neutral, joined forces with Austria. The royal letters had done their work. The end of section 14. Section 15. The French Revolution. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The French Revolution by Hilaire Belloc. Section 15. Chapter 4 continued. The phases of the Revolution. Phase 4 continued. At the critical moment, the French armed forces and the French strongholds were at their worst. The discipline of the army was deplorable. The regular soldiers of the old regime had lost from 6,000 to 9,000 officers by emigration, and mixed no better than water and oil with the revolutionary volunteers who had been drafted to the number over 200 battalions into the ranks of the army. Moreover, these volunteer battalions were for the most part ill provided, far below their establishment. Some only existed on paper, none were trained as soldiers should be trained. In a more orderly time, when the decrees of the government corresponded with the reality, 400,000 men would have held the frontier. Such a number was in the estimates. As it was, from the Swiss mountains to the English Channel, the French could count on no more than 1/5 that number. 80,000 alone were under arms. The full Prussian army was alone, apart from its allies, close upon treble the size of this disorganized and insufficient force. Panics, at once ludicrous and tragic, opened the campaign upon the French side. The King took advantage of them to dismiss his Girondin ministry and to form a reactionary government. The Parliament replied by measures useless to the conduct of war, and designed only to exasperate the Crown, which was betraying the nation. It ordered the dismissal of the Royal Guard, the formation of a camp of revolutionary federals outside Paris, the transportation of the Orthodox priests, in pursuit of the court's determination to resist the Assembly and to await the victorious Allies. Louis vetoed the last two decrees. Lafayette, who was now in command of the army of the centre, with his headquarters at Sedan right upon the route to the invasion, declared for the King. Had the armies of Austria and Prussia moved with rapidity at this moment, their revolution was at an end. As it was, their mobilization was slow, and their march, though accurate, leisurely. It gave time for the populace of Paris to demonstrate against the palace and the royal family on the 20th of June. It was not until the first days of August that the main force of the combined monarchs, under the generalship-in-chief of the Duke of Brunswick, who had the reputation of being the best general of his time, set out for the march on Paris. It was not until the 23rd of August that the invaders took the first French frontier town, Longwy. Meanwhile, two very important things had lent to the French, in spite of the wretched insufficiency of their armed force, an intensity of feeling which did something to supply that insufficiency. In the first place, the third anniversary of the fall of the Bastille, the 14th of July, had called to Paris deputations from all the provinces, many of them armed. This gave the national feeling unity. In the second place, Brunswick had issued from Coblentz, which was his base, upon the 25th of that same month of July, a manifesto which was known in Paris 3 days later, and which, though certain modern historians have questioned this, undoubtedly set revolutionary opinion ablaze. This manifesto demanded, in the name of the Allied army, a complete restoration of the old regime, professed to treat the French and their new authorities as rebels subject to military execution, and contained a clause of peculiar gravity which excited an immediate and exasperated response from Paris. The authorship of this clause lay with Marie Antoinette, and it threatened, if there were any attack upon the palace, to give the capital over to the military execution and total subversion. 2 days later, the Federals from Marseilles, a middle-class body of excellent citizens, though merely amateurs at soldiering and small in numbers, marched into the city. Their marching song has become famous under the title of the Marseillaise. They had accomplished the astonishing feat of traversing France, drawing cannon with them, at the rate of 18 miles a day, in the height of a torrid summer, for close upon a month on end. There is no parallel to such an effort in the history of war, nor did contemporary opinion exaggerate when it saw in the battalion of Marseilles the centre of the coming fight. The shock between the palace and the populace was joined in the morning of the 10th of August. The palace was held by about 6,000 men, of whom some 1,200 were regulars of the Swiss Guard. The palace, the Tuileries, was or should have been impregnable. The popular attack, we may be certain, would have been beaten back had the connection between the Tuileries and the Louvre on the south been properly cut. The flooring had indeed been removed at this point for some distance, but either the gap was not wide enough or the post was insufficiently guarded, for the populace and the Federals, badly beaten in the main attack upon the long front of the palace, succeeded in turning its flank where it joined on to the Louvre, thus enfiladed the suites of rooms and utterly put an end to the resistance of its garrison. Meanwhile the King and Queen, the Dauphin and his little sister, with others of the royal household, had taken refuge during the fighting in the hall of the Parliament. After the victory of the populace, their fate was debated and decided upon. They were imprisoned in the tower of the Temple, a medieval fortress still standing in the northeast of Paris, and though monarchy was not yet formally abolished, the most extreme spirits which the Revolution then contained, and the most vigorous, stepped into the palace of the old executive with Danton at their head. With them appeared, in the seat of government, for the spirit of military action, its contempt for forms, and its rapid decision. The known accomplices of the supporters of the court's resistance and alliance with the invaders were arrested by the hundred. The enrolment of volunteers, already enthusiastic throughout France, was supported with the new vigour of official aid, and the Revolution, left at once all its old moorings to enter an extreme phase. At the same moment the frontier was crossed and the national soil invaded on the 19th of August. It is possible that the delay of the Prussians until that moment had been calculated, for the position in France was complicated and their decision to fight had been tardily arrived at. It was the news of the fall of the palace that seems to have decided them. The place, like the date of this grave event, deserves to be more famous than it is. Brunswick touched what was then French soil in that little triangle where now German and French Lorraine and Luxembourg meet. The village is called Redange. Thence did the privileged of Europe set out to reach Paris and to destroy democracy. The first task occupied them for full 22 years. Upon the latter they are still engaged. What forces the French could there bring against Brunswick were contemptuously brushed aside. 4 days later he had, as we have seen, taken the frontier stronghold of Longwy. Within a week he was in front of Verdun. Verdun had no chance of resistance, no garrison to call a garrison, and no opportunity for defence. The news that it must fall reached Paris on the morning of a fatal date, the 2nd of September. After its fall there would lie nothing between it and the capital, and from that moment the whole nature of the Revolution is wholly transformed by the psychological effect of war. The end of section 15. The end of phase 4. Section 16. The French Revolution. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The French Revolution by Hilaire Belloc. Section 16. Chapter 4 continued. The phases of the Revolution. Phase 5. From the invasion of September 1792 to the establishment of the Committee of Public Safety, April 1793. The fifth phase of the French Revolution may be said to date from these first days of September 1792, when the news of the successful invasion was maddening Paris, and when the revolutionary executive, established upon the ruins of the old dead monarchy and in its image, was firmly in the saddle up to the establishment of the yet more monarchical Committee of Public Safety 7 months later. And these 7 months may be characterized as follows. They were a period during which it was attempted to carry on the revolutionary war against the governments of Europe upon democratic principles. The attempt failed. In the place of discipline and comprehension and foresight, the rising and intense enthusiasm of the moment was depended upon for victory. The pure ideal of the Girondin faction, with the model republic which it hoped to establish, proved wholly insufficient for the conduct of a war. And to save the nation from foreign conquest and the great democratic experiment of the Revolution from disaster, it was necessary that the military and disciplined side of the French, with all the tyranny that accompanies that aspect of their national genius, should undertake the completion of the adventure. This period opens with what are called the massacres of September. I have said upon a former page that the known accomplices and supporters of the Court's alliance with the invaders were arrested by the hundreds upon the fall of the palace and the establishment of a revolutionary executive with Danton at its head. These prisoners, massed in the jails of the city, were massacred to the number of 1,100 by a small but organized band of assassins during the days when the news of the fall of Verdun was expected and reached the capital. Such a crime appalled the public conscience of Europe and of the French people. It must never be confused with the judicial and military acts of the Terror, nor with the reprisals undertaken against rebellion, nor with the gross excesses of mob violence. For though votes in favor of the immediate execution of those who had sided with the enemies of the country were passed in certain primary assemblies, The act itself was the mechanical, deliberate, and voluntary choice of a few determined men. It had, therefore, a character of its own, and that character made it stand out for its contemporaries, as it should stand out for us. It was murder. The prisoners were unarmed. Nay, though treasonable, they had not actually taken arms. Their destruction was inspired, in most of those who ordered it, by mere hatred. Those who ordered it were a small committee acting spontaneously, and Marat was their chief. Footnote: the legend that Danton was connected with the massacre is based on insufficient historical foundation. There are several second or third hand stories in support of it, but the chief positive evidence brought forward in this connection is the stamped paper of the Minister of Justice. It has been amply proved by Dr. Robinet was taken by a subordinate and without Danton's knowledge or complicity. To the much stupider story that the Federals of Marseilles took part in the massacre, the modern student need pay no attention. It has been destroyed piecemeal and on indefeasible documentary evidence in the monograph of Polio and Marcel. It was under the impression of these massacres that the deputies of the new or Third Assembly of the Revolution, known to history as the Convention, met in Paris. This Parliament was to be, at first, the actual, later the nominal governing power in France during the 3 critical years that followed, years which were the military salvation of the Revolution and which therefore permitted the establishment of the democratic experiment in modern Europe. It was on the 20th of September that the Convention met for its first sitting, which was held in the Palace of the Tuileries. During the hours of that day, while it was electing its officials, choosing its speaker and the rest, the French army upon the frontier, to its own astonishment and to that of its enemy, managed to hold in check at the cannonade of Valmy the Allied invaders. Upon the morrow the new assembly met in the riding school, the Ménage, where the 2 former assemblies had also sat. It was about to separate after that day's sitting when one of the members proposed the abolition of royalty. The Convention voted the reform unanimously and dispersed. On the 3rd day, the 22nd of September, it was decreed that the public documents should henceforward bear the date, first year of the Republic. But there was no solemnity on the occasion. The idea of no king was novel and untried. There was as yet no enthusiasm for any save the monarchic form of government. It was not until the title Republic began to connote in men's minds political liberty, and had become also the flag, as it were, for the victorious national defence, that the Republican name acquired in our Europe and from France that strong and almost religious force which it has since retained. The check given to the invaders at Valmy, again to the astonishment of both soldiers and statesmen, determined the campaign. Sickness and the difficulty of communications made the further advance of the invaders impossible. They negotiated for and obtained an unmolested retreat, and a few weeks later they had recrossed the frontier. Meanwhile, in Paris, the great quarrel had begun between the municipal and the national government, which, because Paris was more decided, more revolutionary, and above all, more military in temper than the Parliament, was destined to terminate in the victory of the capital. The Girondins stood still in the Assembly for an ideal republic, a republic enjoying to the utmost limit individual liberty in its citizens and the autonomy of local government in every city and parish. But opposed to this ideal, and far more national, was that of the revolutionary extremists, called in the Convention the Mountain, who had the support of the municipal government of Paris, known as the Commune, and were capable of French victories in the field. These stood for the old French and soldierly conceptions of a strong central government wherewith to carry on the life and death struggle into which the Revolution had now entered. Therefore they conquered. All that autumn the quarrel between France and Europe remained doubtful, for though the armies of the Republic under Dumouriez won the battle of Jemappes, swept across the northeastern frontier and occupied Belgium, while to the south another French army swept right up to the Rhine, Dumouriez himself knew well enough that a campaign undertaken merely upon enthusiasms, and with troops so mixed in character and many of them so undisciplined, would end fatally. But until the advent of the New Year Republic, opinion was not instructed upon these lines, and the Revolutionary War seemed to have passed suddenly from the defence of the national territory to a crusade against the kings and the aristocratic governments of Europe. Enthusiasm, and enthusiasm alone, was the force of the moment. Violent decrees, such as the Decree of Fraternity, which decreed an alliance with all people struggling to be free, and the opening of the Scheldt, a direct violation of treaty rights to which England, among other nations, was a partner, were characteristic of the moment. Chief act of all, the King was put upon his trial at the bar of the Parliament. It was upon the 4th of January 1793. The King had already made his will upon Christmas Day, and the chief orator of the Girondins moved that the sentence should be referred to the people for ratification. The fear of civil war, more than anything else, forbade this just suggestion to pass. Upon the 15th of January the question was put to the Parliament whether the King had been guilty of conspiring against public liberty and of attempting the general safety of the state. Many were absent and many abstained. None replied in the negative. The condemnation of Louis was therefore technically almost a unanimous one. The voting on these grave issues was what the French call nominal. That is, each member was called upon by name to give his vote and an expression of opinion as well, if he so chose. A second attempt to appeal to the people was rejected by 424 to 283. On the third question, which was the decisive one of the penalty, 721 only could be found to vote, and of these a bare majority of 53 declared for death, as against the minority of whom some voted for the death penalty conditionally, that is, not at all, or voted against it. A respite was lost by a majority of 70, and on the 21st of January 1793, at about 10 in the morning, Louis XIV was guillotined. Then followed war with England, with Holland, and with Spain, and almost at that moment began the inevitable reflux of the military tide. For the French eruption to the Rhine in the Low Countries and the Palatinate had no permanent military basis upon which to depend. Dumouriez began to retreat a month after the King's execution, and on the 18th of March suffered a decisive defeat at Neerwinden. It was this retreat, followed by that disaster, which decided the fate of the Girondin attempt to found a republic, ideally, individually and locally free. Already, before the Battle of Neerwinden was fought, Danton, no longer a minister but still the most powerful orator in the Convention, proposed a special court for trying cases of treason, a court which was later called the Revolutionary Tribunal. The news of Neerwinden prepared the way for a stronger measure and some exceptional form of government. A special parliamentary committee, already formed for the control of ministers, was strengthened when, on the 5th of April, after some negotiations and doubt, Dumouriez, despairing of the armies of the Republic, thought to ally his forces with the invaders and to restore order. His soldiers refused to follow him. His treason was apparent. Upon the morrow the Convention nominated that first Committee of Public Safety, which, with its successor of the same name, was henceforward the true despotic and military centre of revolutionary government. It was granted secrecy in deliberation, the virtual though not the theoretic control of the ministry, sums of money for secret expenditure, and, in a word, all the machinery necessary to a military executive. Rousseau's dictator had appeared. The great mind which had given the contrat social to be the gospel of the Revolution had also foreseen one of the necessary organs of democracy in its hardest trial. His theory had been proved necessary and true in fact. 9 members formed this first committee. Barré, who may be called the clerk of it, Danton its genius, and Cambon its financier, were the leading names. With the establishment of this truly national and traditional thing, whose form alone was novel, but whose power and method were native to all the military tradition of Gaul, the Revolution was saved. We have now chiefly to follow the way in which the Committee governed and in which it directed affairs in the great crisis of the war. This sixth phase lasts for nearly 16 months, and from the beginning of April 1793 to the 28th of July 1794, and it is convenient to divide those 16 months into two divisions. The end of section 16, the end of phase 5. Section 17, the French Revolution. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The French Revolution by Hilaire Belloc. Section 17, Chapter 4 continued. The Phases of the Revolution, Phase 6. From April 1793 to July 1794. The first division of this period, which ends in the height of the summer of 1793, is the gradual consolidation of the Committee as a new organ of government, and the peril of destruction which it runs in common with the nation it governs at the hands of Allied Europe. The second period includes part of August and all the rest of 1793, and the first 7 months of 1794, during which time the Committee is successful in its military effort. The nation is saved, and in a manner curiously dramatic and curiously inconsequential, the martial regime of the Terror abruptly ceases. The first step in the consolidation of the power of the Committee was their letting loose of the Commune of Paris and the populace it governed against the Girondins. Looked at merely from the point of view of internal politics, upon which most historians have concentrated, the attack of the populace of Paris and their Commune against the Parliament seems to be no more than the end of the long quarrel between the Girondins with their ideal federal republic and the capital with its instinct for strong centralized government. But in the light of the military situation, of which the Committee of Public Safety were vividly aware, and which it was their business to control, a very different tale may be told. When the defeats began, the Parliament had voted a levy of 300,000 men. It was a mere vote which came to very little, not enough in numbers, and still less in morale for the type of troops recruited under a system of money forfeit and purchased substitutes was wholly beneath the task of the Great War. This law of conscription had been passed upon the 24th of February. The date for its first application was, in many villages, fixed for the 10th of March. All that country which borders the estuary of the Loire, to the north and to the south, a country whose geographical and political peculiarities need not detain us here, but which is still curiously individual, began to resist. The decree was unpopular everywhere. Of course, as military service is everywhere unpopular with a settled population. But here it had no ally, for the Revolution and all its works were grossly unpopular as well. The error of the civil constitution of the clergy was a powerful factor in this revolt. The piety and orthodoxy of this district were and are exceptional. Some such resistance in some such quarter was perhaps expected, but what was not expected was its military success. 4 days before the defeat of Neerwinden itself, and 4 days after the decree of conscription in the village, a horde of peasantry had taken possession of the town of Chaillot in the southern part of this district, Vendée. 3 days before the Committee of Public Safety was formed, the insurgents had defeated regular forces at Macoul and had tortured and put to death their prisoners. The month of April, when the Committee of Public Safety was first finding its seat in the saddle, saw the complete success of the rebels. The forces sent against them were worthless, for all military effort had been concentrated upon the frontier. Most of them were not even what we should call militia. A small force of regulars was to have moved from Orleans, but before they could attack, Thouars, Parthenay and Fontenay fell into the power of the rebels. These posts afforded an advanced triangle right into the regularly administered territory of the Republic. The great town of Nantes was outflanked. Even in such a moment the Girondins still clung to their ideal, an individually free and locally autonomous republic. It is little wonder that the temper of Paris refused to support them, or their influence over the Parliament. And we can easily understand how the new committee supported Paris in its revolt. That revolt took place on the 31st of May. The forces under the command of the capital did not march, but a deputation of the sections of Paris demanded the arrest of the leading Girondins. The body of the debating hall was invaded by the mob. The Committee of Public Safety pretended to compromise between Paris and the Parliament, but a document recently analysed sufficiently proves that their sympathy was with the Parisian attack. They proposed, indeed, to put the armed forces of Paris at the disposition of the Assembly, that is, in their own hands. That day nothing of the movement was done, but the Parliament had proved of no strength in the face of the capital. On the frontier the advance of the invaders had begun. The great barrier fortress of Valenciennes relied for its defence upon the neighbouring camp of Famars. The garrison of that camp had been compelled to evacuate it by the advance of the Allied army upon the 23rd of May, and though some days were to be spent before the heavy artillery of the Austrians could be emplaced, Valenciennes was henceforward at the mercy of its besiegers. There was news that La Vendée was not the only rebellion. Lyons had risen 3 days before. There had been heavy fighting. The Royalists and the Girondins had combined and had carried the town hall and established an insurrectionary and unelected municipal government. Such news, coming immediately after the 31st of May, roused the capital to action. This time the Parisian forces actually marched against the Parliament. The demand for the suspension of the 22 named Girondin deputies was made under arms. Much has been written, and by the best historians, to make of this successful day a mere conquest by the Commune of Paris over the Parliament. Though Bayard and Danton both protested in public, it was in reality their politics that conquered with Paris. To the 22 names that the forces of Paris had listed, 7 were added. The great Girondins, Brissot, Vergniaud, and the rest, were not indeed imprisoned. They were considered under arrest in their houses. But the moral authority of the Convention as an administrative machine, not as a legislative one, was broken on this day, the 2nd of June, 1793. Paris had ostensibly conquered, but the master, who was stronger than ever and whom Paris had served, was the Committee of Public Safety. This first Committee of Public Safety endured to the 10th of July. In the midst of such a war and of such an internal struggle, the Convention had voted, upon the public initiative of the Committee of Public Safety, the famous Constitution of '93, that prime document of democracy which, as though to mock its own ideal, has remained no more than a written thing from then until now. Therein will be found universal suffrage, therein the yearly Parliament, therein the referendum, therein the elected executive, a thing no Parliament would ever give us to this day. The Constitution was passed but 3 weeks after the successful insurrection of Paris. A fortnight later, still on the 10th of July, the first of the Committee of Public Safety was followed by its successor. All this while the Vendéans were advancing. Nantes indeed had held out against the rebels, but as we shall see in a moment, the Republican troops had not yet made themselves good. The rebellion of Lyons was fortifying itself, and a week later was to execute the radical Hilaire. Marseilles was rising. On the 10th of July the Convention summoned to its bar Westermann, the friend of Danton, who had suffered defeat at the hands of the Western rebels. It is well to note at this point one of those small individual factors which determine the fate of states. Danton, the master of all that first movement toward the centralization, the man who had made the 10th of August, who had negotiated with the Prussians after Valmy, who had determined upon and formed a central government against the Girondin anarchy, had broken down. His health was gone. He was a giant in body, but for the moment he had tired himself out. The renewing of his committee was proposed. He was thrust out from the new choice. Barrière remained to link the old committee with the new. A violent sectarian Calvinist pastor, Jean-Born Saint-André, among the bravest and most warped of the revolutionaries, Couthon, a friend of Robespierre, Saint Just, a still more intimate friend, a young, handsome, enormously courageous and decisive man, entered with others, to the number of 9, the new committee. 17 days later, on the 27th of July, Robespierre replaced one of the minor members thus chosen. He had precisely a year to live, and it is the moment for fixing before the reader's mind the nature of his career. The end of section 17. Section 18. The French Revolution. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The French Revolution by Hilaire Belloc. Section 18, Chapter 4 continued. The Phases of the Revolution. Phase 6 continued. Robespierre was at this moment the chief figure in the eyes of the crowd, and was soon to be the chief revolutionary figure in the eyes of Europe. That is the first point. The second is of equal importance, and is far less generally recognized. He was not, and was never destined to be, the chief force in the revolutionary government. As to the first point, Robespierre had obtained this position from the following combination of circumstances. First, alone of the revolutionary personalities, he had been continually before the public eye from the beginning. He had been a member of the first Parliament of all, and had spoken in that Parliament in the first month of its sessions. Though then obscure in Versailles, he was already well known in his province and the native town of Arras. Secondly, this position of his in the public eye was maintained without a break, and his position and reputation had increased by accumulation month after month for the whole 4 years. No one else was left in the political arena of whom this could be said. All the old reactionaries had gone, all the moderate men had gone. The figures of 1793 were all new figures, except Robespierre, and he owed this continued and steady increase of fame to, thirdly, his conspicuous and vivid sincerity. He was more wholly possessed of the democratic faith of the contrat social than any other man of his time. He had never swerved from an article of it. There is no better engine for enduring fame than the expression of real convictions. Moreover, fourthly, his speeches exactly echoed the opinions of his audience, and echoed them with a lucidity which his audience could not have commanded. Whether he possessed true eloquence or no is a matter still debated by those who are scholars in French letters, but it is certain that he had in his own time all the effects of a great orator, though his manner was precise and cold. Fifthly, he was possessed of a consistent body of doctrine. That is, he was not only convinced of the general democratic creed which his contemporaries held, and he not only held it unswervingly and uncorruptedly, but he could supplement it with a system of morals and even something which was the adumation of religion. Sixthly, he had, as such characters always can, but not often do, gather round themselves a group of intensely devoted personal admirers and supporters, chief of whom was the young and splendidly courageous Saint Just. It was the combination of all these things, I say, which made Robespierre the chief personality in the public eye when he entered the Committee of Public Safety on the 27th of July, 1793. Now, let it be noted that, unlike his follower Saint Just, and exceedingly unlike Danton, Robespierre possessed none of those military qualities without which it is impossible to be responsible for government. over a military nation, especially if that nation be in the act of war. And such a war! The Committee of Public Safety was the Caesar of revolutionary France. Robespierre, as a member of that Caesar, was hopeless. His popularity was an advantage to his colleagues in the committee, but his conception of action upon the frontier was vague, personal and futile. His ambition for leadership, if it existed, was subordinate to his ambition to be the saviour of his people and of their democratic experiment, and he had no comprehension of those functions of leadership by which it can coordinate, detail and impose a plan of action. Robespierre, therefore, in every crisis of the last year we are about to study, yielded to his colleagues, never impressed them and never led them, and yet, it was the irony of his fate, was imagined by his fellow countrymen and by the warring governments of Europe to be the master of them all. The first weeks after his appearance in the Committee of Public Safety were the critical weeks of the whole revolutionary movement. The despotic action of Paris, which I have concluded to be secretly supported by the Committee, had provoked insurrection upon all sides in the provinces. Normandy had protested, and on the 13th of July a Norman girl stabbed Marat to death. Lyons, as we have seen, had been some weeks in revolt. Marseilles had rebelled in the first week of June. Bordeaux, on the whole department of the Gironde, had of course risen, for their men were at stake. Later, Toulon, the great naval depot of France, revolted. A reactionary municipal provincial government was formed in that port. The little boy imprisoned in the Temple, heir to the kingdom, was proclaimed under the title of Louis XVII. And before the end of August, the English and Spanish fleets had been admitted into the harbour, and an excellent foreign garrison was defending the town against the national government. Meanwhile, the Allies upon the Belgian frontier were doing what they could, taking fortress after fortress, and while Mayence was falling on the Rhine, Valenciennes and Conde were capitulating on the northeastern border, and a portion of the Allied army was marching to besiege Dunkirk. The insurrection in Vendée, which had broken out in the early part of the year, though checked by the resistance of Nantes, was still successful in the field. Footnote: on page 403 of my monograph on Danton, Nesbitt and Company, 1899, the reader will find an unpublished report of the Committee of Public Safety drawn up immediately before the destruction of the Girondins on the 31st of May. It forms, in my view, conclusive evidence, read in the light of their other actions, of the Committee's determination to side with Paris. It was in the month of August that a successful effort was made. Carnot, who soon proved the military genius of the Revolution, entered the Committee of Public Safety. On the 23rd of the month a true levy, very different from the futile and insufficiently applied attempt of the spring, was forced upon the nation by a vote in Parliament. It was a levy of men, vehicles, animals and provision, and soon furnished something not far short of 500,000 soldiers. With September the tide turned. The first victory in this crisis of the struggle of Hondschoote relieved Dunkirk in the early days of September. By mid-October a second and decisive victory, that of Wattignies, relieved Maubeuge. Lyons had been taken. Normandy was pacified long before. By the end of the year Toulon was reoccupied, and at the same time the last cohesive force of the Vendéans destroyed. But meanwhile the crisis had had a double effect, moral and material. The moral effect had been a sort of national madness in which the most extreme measures were proposed, and many of them carried through with what one may call a creative audacity. The calendar itself was changed, the week itself abolished, the months renamed and readjusted. Such an act sufficiently symbolizes the mental attitude of the revolutionaries. They were determined upon a new earth. There went with this last and most violent attack upon what was believed to be the last remnants of Catholicism in the country a hideous persecution of the priesthood, in which an uncounted number of priests died under the rigors of transportation or of violence. The reprisals against the rebels varied from severity of the most awful kind to cruelty that was clearly insane, and of which the worst examples took place at Arras and Nantes. In all this turmoil, the governing centre of the country, the Committee of Public Safety, not only kept its head, but used the enormous forces of the storm for the purposes of achieving military success under that system known as the Terror, which was for them no more than martial law and an engine of their despotic control. Of the 2,000 and more that passed before the Revolutionary Tribunal and were executed in Paris, the large majority were those whom the Committee of Public Safety judged to be obstacles to their military policy, and most were men or women who had broken some specific part of the martial code which the government had laid down. Some were generals who had failed or were suspected of treason, and some, among the most conspicuous, were politicians who had attempted to check so absolute a method of conducting the war. Of these, the greatest was Danton. Before the end of 1793, he began to protest against the system of the Terror. He believed, perhaps, that the country was now safe in the military sense, and needed such rigours no more. But the Committee disagreed, and were evidence available, we should perceive that Carnot in particular determined that such opposition must cease. Danton and his colleagues, including Desmoulins, the journalist of the Revolution and the chief publicist who promoted the days of July 1789, were executed in the first week of April 1794. The end of section 18.